Hello and welcome to Broadcasts from Fiddler's Green, my weekly podcast where I discuss culture, politics, and current events. Today on this episode, I don't really have much of a talk to give. Usually these podcasts involve an hour-long talk on a given current event. However, this week, due to Halloween with my family, I had basically zero prep time, so I was considering to just do a Ask Me Anything. Then at the last minute, when I was sort of ruminating on the news, I came up with a few topics I thought might be worth discussing. This last week has been there's been a lot of dark events that have happened. Just last night, we had the Brazilian elections, and I've been saying for a while now that this coming election is going to happen for the midterms in the United States that's occurring basically 7 days from now. This is going to be a watershed moment, not so much in the consequences of the actual election. Midterms usually don't have that much of a political consequence in terms of the direction of the government in any meaningful sense. But they're going to have it's going to be a watershed moment when it comes to how amenable anything in the government is to electoral pressure. By all typical measures of Republican politics as they've existed in the last 100 years in America, the Democrats deserve to lose massively. But is that how elections work anymore? It seems that something fundamental has changed. And the things that I'm seeing from Brazil just today, I wasn't really even aware. I was aware of this election because progressives were whining about Bolsonaro as usual. But I wasn't sort of aware of this eerily symmetrical fallout from the Brazilian elections. How much it seemed to reflect the fallout that came from 2020 in America. So Bolsonaro is sort of the populist, quote unquote, right-wing president of Brazil. And he won an election over this sort of quasi-socialist cathedral puppet, Lula. I don't even remember what Lula's name is. It's some three-part name that no one can remember. Everyone knows him by his sort of political moniker, Lula. And he's sort of like a Hugo Chavez type character. He was brought in the early 2000s in that big sort of quasi-socialist wave that struck South America. At any rate, tell me if you haven't heard this story before. A very popular populist right-wing leader goes into an election with a fairly strong economy, a very broad base of support, and a feeling that he has things wrapped up. None of his supporters that voted for him in the previous election think that he did a bad job, and he had an incredible lead in the previous election. Then, due to a surprise last-minute vote count towards the end of the process that evening, suddenly his opponent just gets an enormous surge of votes delivered to his doorstep, and these votes are all votes from people who didn't vote in the previous election, apparently. We can say that because Bolsonaro got more votes than he did in his previous previous run when he secured the presidency. And now, even though he's increased his margin, somehow, 10 million votes just appeared for his opponent virtually out of nowhere, conjured out of thin air, and with very, very little paperwork behind them. Not that there is very much in an anonymous election generally, where you're just putting things into black boxes. But this represents the path that elections are taking now, where it's not even very clear that the election results are due to some kind of dialogue the American people are having. Back in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected, it was very clear that America was tired of the neocons. They were tired of George W. Bush. They were angry at George W. Bush. And it was palatable. People who had voted for Bush in 2004 were now sick of him, and they had become largely disillusioned with the war in Iraq and the other Bush-era policies. Rightfully so, in my opinion. And so you could see the election of Barack Obama as the swinging of a certain population from the Republican column to the Democrats. But since then, and since 2012 in particular, and I guess you could say maybe 2016 was an exception, because there was definitely the forgotten voter who voted for Barack Obama in 2008 who then voted for Trump. But since then, going from 2012 to 2018 to 2020, the elections have been decided by these mystery demographics that just somehow switch. They kind of come online. They're a political dark matter. No one sees them before the election. They don't show up on polls. Votes just kind of appear because certain demographics vote in on main year elections, not on off year elections. And they come from demographics that don't really participate in polls, I guess, or don't participate in national conversation. And it's all very mysterious. It's like the whole process was generated by a mysterious black box in advance. We'll see what happens with the American elections in what, 10, I think it's actually literally 7 days, literally a week from now. But this does represent, I believe, an end of an era. And I think that we're coming to sort of the hard disillusionment people will have with democracy. The fact that we're just kind of coming to terms with the new way that people do politics, the new way that we have to experience politics, not as people who participate in a conversation, but people who kind of witness it like weather coming in and coming out. These are the political winds that are being generated, God knows by whom, and we have to put up with it. We have to survive through it. We have to slowly become disillusioned and realigned to these new realities of how politics actually works. I talked a lot about this. I actually talk about this all the time on this podcast. The disillusionment is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a necessary thing. It's a necessary step in our development. It's a necessary transformation that we're undergoing as people or as displaced people, coming to terms with what hard political reality looks like, with what real politics actually looks like, and slowly moving painfully out of the boomer truth regime and into actual hard reality, where ideas have consequences, and not knowing who you are or what you believe in has dire ramifications for yourself and your family and the collective you think you represent, potentially in perpetuity. I think a lot about this when I was listening to, I can call him my friend. I don't know if I've actually met this person, but I have been listening to his channel a lot in the last week since I just discovered he had a channel, along with Ryan Turnipseed, another person that I was aware of, but wasn't aware that they actually had a YouTube channel. I was listening to Jay Burden, and one of the things he talks a lot about is, and I don't know if he has put quite a fine a point on it as I have, but he talks about how he considers this ultimate political nemesis to be David French. And I kind of agree. I very much agree with him. David French is this neocon dinosaur. And I know Jay Burden has said this along with a lot of other people on our side. You get this absolutely bizarre feeling when you watch David French speak and when you hear him write. And it's this weird affectation, this weird separation from reality, as if he is having these thoughts, experiencing these emotions in some kind of hermetically sealed bottle. It's not. It's less like he's actually talking about politics, and more like he's role playing politics. He's creating politics in the abstract in a totally in a reality that no longer exists. And last week I talked about this whole type of Rodri, her writer, who seems to be continuously rediscovering the fact that he does not live in the year 2005, that things have actually changed in the subsequent 17 years, and that the American normalcy that he was so sure about and that he had based his entire identity on is no longer in existence. With David French, his most recent offering happened today when he was talking about, oh man, Christians, they're whining so much about religious liberty all the time. And don't you know, religious liberty has been winning more and more in the courts. We have more enumerated religious liberty rights than we ever have had. We have more religious liberty case law and religious liberty precedents than we've ever had before. Look at all the religious liberty I've gotten for you guys. And of course, because David French is this absolutely bizarre adult bug man, he can't help pat himself on the back and do sort of like, and do this sort of the Instagram, whatever the boomer equivalent of the Instagram thought, doing the duck face for the camera. Good job, David French. I got you all these new religious liberty rights, and you idiot chud Christians out there, you're not aware of how much you have. You're ungrateful. You're not aware of how good you had it. Just think how bad everything was for evangelical Christians in the 90s. Again, this is insane. And what he says, how David French poses this is again, he does the very irritating thing that I really hate, is he lapses into the left's own language. He is somebody who purportedly has right-wing epistemology and who has right-wing values. And although he's a neocon, I do know some good neocons. I mean, Ross Douthat's sort of in that camp, and he's not nearly as insufferable. But what David French can't help him do this thing, one of my pet peeves, where even though he's ostensibly a man of the right, he lapses into the mainstream progressive narrative and borrows their terms to countersignal everyone else in his own camp. And this time it is, well, you know what actually is going on, guys? What actually is going on is Christians have more rights, but they have less privilege and power. They've just lost their power, and they're whining about losing all of their power. And you hear this, and I mean, no one in the actual real world who is aware of the relative health of evangelical Christian communities in the 1990s versus the 2020s can. I can't imagine anyone in this situation can listen to this stuff with a straight face. The idea that things are better than they've ever been because somehow there's more verbiage, there's more jurisprudential documents now in record describing religious liberty. The idea that this is an impactful thing is just so absolutely risible that I can't believe a grown man would repeat this in public. And it should be obvious to anyone who listens to this that this is absolutely bizarre. But more than that, I mean, when people complain about David French, and I think Fritz Imperial was talking about how he was sort of like the Saruman-ic character or whatever, and whatever. I mean, I think he's way too pathetic to be a Saruman. Saruman was kind of a cool guy, although very worldly, like David French is, and I am actually kind of grateful for David French because this is such a teachable moment. I think originally, I think David French was a very detestable person because what he was selling was so obviously fake and it was seen as more of a temptation. But I can't imagine how low of an IQ you have to have as a right-wing Christian to believe this stuff anymore. And instead, what I'm seeing David French as more of a teachable moment. This person is here to teach us why the Enlightenment is bullshit. And I'm convinced after watching that David French tweet and seeing his subsequent conversation with his buddy, uber libertarian Christian friend, that this is the beginning of the end of our belief in rights writ large. This concept of rights is absolutely ridiculous, and it goes on to, it really goes back to people like Joseph de Maistre. And what is a right? Just like when you understand, when you look at your own mind, and you've done this for a long enough time. And one thing I appreciate about religion is it does sort of, as a modern person, there's many things that are hard to do about religion. It's very hard to believe in miracles. It's very hard to believe it's very hard to believe in historical records. You'll recognize this as a thoroughly modern person. The case for Jesus' resurrection in terms of archaeology is actually pretty good once you believe in miracles. It's highly attested to. There are skeptical sources that describe the crucifixion and the lack of a body and all this, and you can read apologetics in your own time listening to the case for Christ's resurrection. But as a modern person, that's not what I struggle with. As a modern person, I struggle with the idea that any document that is older than 1,000 years old is not some kind of amalgamated propaganda that's so polluted by the passage of time I can't possibly trust it. And so the me putting faith in any kind of historical occurrence that occurred before 1000 AD is just a huge struggle for my modern mind. And so as a modern Christian who tries to follow all of the religious strictures, and I just realized upon saying that I should wish all my fellow Catholics happy All Saints Day. And yes, happy All Saints Day. It is a feast of the church, so celebrate accordingly. But to go back to my point, as a modern believer, I have to struggle with all of these things. The difficulty of believing in miracles, of keeping up prayer life, of not always having a very solid religious community. But one thing that you are taught as a modern religious believer is how to kind of observe your mind going through the process of belief and then determining the consequences of those beliefs. It's impossible as a modern believer not to take ownership of the fact that you are in possession of an ideology that you adhere to. These are my ideas. These are my moral axioms. I believe in grace. I believe in God. I believe in truth, goodness, and beauty. And what does that mean? How do I imagine truth, goodness, and beauty in its relation to God? And how do I believe? When I say soul, what do I mean by soul? What part of the process I'm experiencing right now in my mind is my soul, and what is the product of my psychology and my circumstances? And these are all interesting questions, and questions that do have apologetic answers if you want to look into them. But what's so useful about this process of being a modern believer is you're aware of actually doing it in a way that I wasn't as an unbeliever when I talked about things like rights and the way I think David French is talking about the concept of rights in this article. I don't think David French actually knows what rights are. What are rights? Rights are promises that are explicitly made in language and usually in writing, made by a sovereign power or powers generally to people who have less power or no power. And the idea is that because keeping promises is part of the covenant of rulership, it's part of that ruler maintaining his mandate of heaven, the sovereign or the power in question will be duty bound to honor this promise. And so the person who's given this promise has something that he can hopefully cash for a reward, either in a legal sense or in a sense of explicit privilege. The problem is that this is one of the key insights of in particular, I'm thinking of Joseph de Maistre and one of his. It's always hard to pick a favorite one of Joseph de Maistre, but one of the ones that I found the most striking and which I read for my audiobooks channel was his treatise on the nature of constitutions. When we talk about constitutions or rights or promises made by the powerful, de Maistre says, the fact that you have to speak them or announce them or write them down isn't a product of their strength, but a product of their weakness. You write things down because you're worried about people betraying you. You're worried about people going back on things. And I think this is something that everyone knew prior to the Enlightenment. And then in the Enlightenment, we sort of unlearned this. And, we could also say that this is something that the founding fathers knew as well. And that's sort of the deep irony with David French, is that he's unlearned not only the ancient wisdom of the pre-Enlightenment, but the wisdom of the Enlightenment as well. But just as an example, any free person in a free society who has a sovereign that is just and not a tyrant, who has a power who rules over him, a government that is actually interested in their well-being to a certain extent, and is not willing to just farm them for whatever profit can be juiced out of them before they're discarded. Any citizen, any free man living under that system will have a number of afforded powers and reservations and privileges that are not explicitly promised, and therefore not explicitly rights. They're just part of being a free citizen. Think of, for instance, the rights that parents have over children. These aren't enumerated in the Constitution because the idea that parents have a right to raise their own children was considered to be obvious. It was considered to be just what free people did. It didn't need to be enumerated because it wasn't under political contention. And you'll see this again and again and again, is that the most important powers and privileges that we reserve for ourselves are the ones that are least stated. It's always better to be a homeowner than it is to have a right to a house or a right to housing, worse yet. It's always better to have a family than have a right to company or a right to familial contact. These things only exist, these rights are only explicit because there's a threat involved. My favorite example of this is this. Think about, and a lot of people compare David French to dhimmitude. Dhimmitude is the status that Christians and Jews had under Islamic rule. And what's so interesting about dhimmitude is that Islamic rule was in some sense fair-ish, but it was also tyrannical to a certain degree, in the sense that the Christians who lived under it were very obviously just being juiced for their capital. They were not treated as actual citizens is a misnomer. It's sort of a modern it's sort of this Enlightenment era thing that's been corrupted. They were not treated as sort of sovereign peoples that were direct wards of the states. They were almost like resources that needed to be taken care of, like an oil supply or a rare mineral deposit. They were a way to get wealth, and they needed to be farmed responsibly, but they were farmed. And because of this, you can see all sorts of weird things going on under Islamic law that are kind of being brought back in our current era of bad government. And so here's a good example of rights in action. So during the long Islamic interregnum, in many places like Greece and still in places like Asia Minor, it was a common practice for Muslim men to steal Christian girls away from their family, forcibly convert them to Islam, and then bully them into marrying Muslim men via threats of anti-apostasy laws. Right? Once someone converts to Islam in Islamic society, they can't convert back at a threat of death. And if you forcibly convert this girl, what's her testimony going to mean? Right? They'll just tell her. They'll just say, "Oh no, this is a disrespectful girl that's trying to apostatize," and the Islamic court will believe them, and that's a way to basically kidnap Christian girls away from their families and force them to marry people they don't want to marry and force them out of the faiths of their fathers. And people are not incorrect when they compare this practice, which was very common in many Muslim countries, to what was going on in modern grooming gang situations. But what is less often spoken about is this kind of farming of Christian girls from demi-Christian populations in the Muslim world actually had a lot of opposition from the Islamic governments because the Islamic governments were using Christians as a tax base. And if everyone just stole all the Christian women and sucked that community dry and destroyed it, and all the Christians either fled or were bred out of existence instantaneously, the taxes, which were substantial, that were being farmed out of this incredibly industrious community, would evaporate and the Islamic State would completely financially collapse. So what you'd have a lot of caliphs and sultans do, and emirs, is they would give rights to Christian families to you have the right not to have your daughter kidnapped and forcibly converted to Islam. Okay, great. But, there's a lot of abuses like this. There were a lot of attempts of Muslims of burning down churches, and there were a lot of attempts of Muslims of just outright cheating Christians. And every time this would come up, the caliph or whoever would give Christians a right, not to have their church burned down, not to be stolen from it with impunity, not to be absolutely cheated or beaten up for being Christian. And so, at the end of this process, the Christian is sitting there, with a lot of these rights, and a lot of this jurisprudence is stacked up. Wow, you have the right not to be raped, your daughter not to be kidnapped. But it's all meaningless. The only reason these rights exist was that was a reality of living in these Islamic countries to begin with. The fact that they had to be stated by the government meant that they were under threat. And the same thing is true for our own situation right now. We're going to have more rights and more jurisprudence describing our rights than we ever had. And yet we're going to have less safety, a markedly decreased ability to practice religions that are contrary to the state religion, and we're going to be under constant threat of a narco-tyranny. And David French will be patting himself on the back all the way to this absolutely decrepit state. And it will be a learning experience because David French has unlearned the very concern that the founders had to begin with, that enumerated rights themselves would slowly over time be used to besmirch and downplay unexplicit rights, natural rights, rights that were always considered to be the purview of the free peoples that were being ruled over by the government. We will learn to value the unstated over the stated more and more. And people like David French are a pathway to this. And something that I think David French is just this invaluable resource at this stage. He couldn't be a better illustration about how all of this Constitution stuff is absolute bullshit. And that the people who will participate in this are either complete suckers or they're the biggest snakes of all time. And if they're laughing their way all the way to the bank, the people who they're ripping off are their children. And it's funny, but I imagine this is the fate of all centrists, and it's going to be a damn necessary lesson at this stage. Pretty unorganized talk this time, but fresh from the David French's latest embarrassing faux pas. I kind of, it's funny because it's funny because the things that we really need to learn from this age are subtle. And people, there's a risk with David French that we will take the wrong lessons from these weak Christian leaders. There was another example that happened a few weeks ago of this brutal murder of this promising high school senior. I think he was 18, and he was just gunned down for apparently no reason in front of his girlfriend at a shopping mall in front of a Dave & Buster's. And he comes from a Christian family. This guy he's literally literally like this Giga Chad with the blonde cheerleader girlfriend, the hope of America, Flash Gordon. And these absolutely just these cartoons of these sort of degenerate gangster guys are are the people apparently responsible for killing him? I don't know, right? This is still an ongoing investigation, although I can't imagine that there's much controversy in this, considering that there are apparently multiple witnesses. But all of this is irrelevant. You know, the race and religion of the people involved in the shooting are irrelevant. What's relevant is that what's relevant for the right wing is sort of the behavior of the parents afterwards. And a lot of people talked about this. And it's a behavior that a lot of people associate with Christians like David French, is that before their son's body is even cold, before they know the circumstances of their son's death, both his parents and his girlfriend are already forgiving the killers. And so the media tidbits, the media sound bites we have from this atrocious crime are just these sound bites of these Christians pre-forgiving the brutal murder of their own son before they even know the circumstances of the murder, or before any justice has actually been procured. This is absolutely insane. This is not how forgiveness was supposed to be used, because although I want to applaud their piety, what they're doing, they're broadcasting something that is frankly unjust. That's frankly not in keeping from any classical understanding of how justice should actually operate and how Christian forgiveness should be expressed. And this is the weird thing, because I think that it's so important to value both sides of this equation and both sides of this reality. What a lot of right-wingers want to do is like just close the door on forgiveness. Oh my God. And you know, this makes you want to, right? Because what the establishment wants to do, what they want to say is that we need to forgive these sins. Like there is no corresponding call to justice. Like there was no crime to begin with. Like these crimes were all understandable products of circumstances. These crimes were all just emanations from a social order that's beyond our control, and Christians' job is just to grin and bear it and to prop up the unjust system as it exists and to not think too hard about it, because thinking too hard would really compromise your Christian mission. It's the exact product of that meme of that supremely non-Christian looking guy lecturing the person about how, well, Jesus said to be compassionate. So that means that you need to allow murders and illegal immigration and the transgression of your society. And sure, I'm not a Christian and I have nothing but contempt from Christianity, but maybe if I quote this Bible passage, you'll do what I say. Christianity does not command us to suspend our inclinations towards justice, or to abandon the pursuit of justice, or to abandon the pursuit of righteousness, just because we're also commanded to be forgiving. Forgiveness has to be part of truth. And and I don't want to pry into the individual souls of the individual people involved in that scenario with the murder, because maybe they did go through this process and all we're seeing as a media soundbite is that last little piece of it to make it sound like they're doing this. But inevitably, what Christian leaders are encouraged to do is to basically use forgiveness as a tool to obliterate truth and to obliterate accountability and to obliterate our pursuit of justice. And that's a crime. That's doing what C.S. Lewis had this great line back in the day, who said that Satan loves creating vices that are in opposition to each other, so that we can reject one vice and prefer another one, and congratulate ourselves on being good for rejecting vice one, all the while we completely indulge ourselves in vice number two. And that's what I really believe is going on here. Case in point, I believe sincerely that this week the right-wing Twitter has fallen for an absolute bait of an article. The Cathedral dribbled out a piece of bait, and virtually every intelligent right-winger fell for it, people probably know what I'm talking about, but there was this article from the Atlantic Monthly, which is core cathedral magazine. This is something that everyone reads in the places where opinions are made. It's one of the core jet-setting elite magazines like the New Republic or the New York Times. The Atlantic Monthly. It doesn't hurt that they were first on the internet bandwagon in the early 2000s as well. But at any rate, the Atlantic Monthly printed this absolute bait of an article where this writer, Emily Oster, I think her name was, she wrote this article. Well, it's time for COVID amnesty. Everyone made mistakes during COVID. So we need just a blanket amnesty for people to be wrong and to admit that they were wrong and just move forward with forgiveness and love and caring for all. And man, do I disagree with this, right? And the way she's presenting it is, we destroyed your lives. We fired you from your jobs. We exposed you to unsafe viruses. We exposed you potentially to unsafe medication. We completely covered up data, and we changed the narrative multiple times to benefit ourselves. And we called you conspiracy theorists and nuts for wanting to bury your dead and worship in your churches and just destroy the old world and destroy the economy. And now we want you to let us back into power with an oopsie, and it's all forgiven, and now we'll just go back to life as normal. And that's absolute bullshit. That can't happen. There's no way I guess it could happen, and certainly if the establishment could write their own narratives on how COVID ends, especially when a lot of their apologetics are falling apart. We now definitively know the impact that COVID has had on children, that it has had on our economy. And we also know that many of the claims they have about the efficacy of certain countermeasures, and I won't specify which ones, were massively overstated, and many dangers about those countermeasures were massively understated. And so, and not to mention the whole idea of origin of this pathogen, which increasingly paper after paper is demonstrating was probably of human origin, almost certainly at this stage. Other than a few minority reports that are frequently printed and reprinted in the New York Times, at this point I've seen so much evidence that it must have come from this lab. It's hard to imagine exactly how it couldn't have. And of course, just the sheer probability of it being a coincidence seems outrageous. The idea that they're going to essentially destroy society and walk away with it with their power intact is nuts. And if they were able to do that, we might as well call ourselves serfs, because or slaves, because there is absolutely no case or counterpoint we can ever bring against power. Again, we are completely powerless for the time being. And of course, but here's the problem. Here's the mistake that I think I wouldn't be surprised if this was the intention of the article. Is that of course the amnesty or forgiveness in the way that Emily Oster is describing it in her article, that can't happen. There has to be truth. There has to be justice. There has to be a changing of power. There has to be an explanation of how this will never happen again, and how the people who did it will permanently be displaced from their positions. And new government and new direction have to be instituted. And of course, amnesty implies that that's not going to happen. But at the same time, there are some people on the right who use this as an opportunity to claim that they were just going to hang everyone who is moderately involved in the mainstream COVID narrative, from the journalists to the doctors to the researchers, to the, maybe your aunt on Facebook who is a mask Nazi back in 2020, to all the hypochondriac spoony women who are still suffering from long COVID and who are on their 7th COVID vaccination. We're just going to, an unparalleled amount of violence in Minecraft is going to await these individuals on the discovery of any of these key COVID truths that are going to come out. And, this is just blaring out of right-wing Twitter. And the more extreme you can paint this picture of vindictive, extreme, and unnecessary violence, like the more based you are. And that's the reply that comes out of right-wing Twitter. And does anyone ever ask themselves if that's not the exact point of this article to begin with? I mean, do you think that they were actually asking for forgiveness in this article written by this sort of middle-of-the-road centrist in the Atlantic Monthly? You think that this is their confessional? They were giving up power to that this Atlantic article was them surrendering and giving you their sword and asking for forgiveness, throwing themselves at the mercy of the court. This was their confession. This wasn't their confession. They were baiting an extreme overreaction from the right wing so that they could scare the bejesus out of every single moderate doctor who was on board with their narrative in 2020, to convince them that if they ever switched sides, the side they switched to would lynch them before it ever made them an ally. To make it increasingly impossible for elites to defect from the mainstream position, to defect from the position of the cathedral, and to make them feel like it's either stick with the mainstream lie or you're going to be hung up. You're going to be executed. You're now part of the team. We've burnt our ships. This was not the cathedral confessing its sins. This was the cathedral trying to elicit a reaction that would demonstrate its own wavering centrists that there was no way back. The trans community does this too. They put in place all sorts of disgusting types of threats against detransitioners to convince them that they have to stay trans, stay silent, or be destroyed, either by the trans community themselves due to backlash, or maybe just due to right-wingers. And I hate to say this, but the lack of proper forgiveness, proper reconciliation has been a tool both of the transgender movement and of the modern establishment medical mainstream to keep moderate dissenters in line, because they don't feel that there's any alternative. One of the big utilities that the right has had in its back pocket was its incredibly forgiving attitude to people who find themselves in the position of detransitioners, people who were lied to. That forgiveness is not just a religious duty. It is the mode of any responsible form of government. When the left was ascendant, when the left was gaining power, when the left was building its institutions, it understood the power of the exchange, truth and reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation. You give us a confession, you give us contrition, you give us the truth, all of your truth, all of your involvement. We obtain some quantum of justice. And there can be reconciliation, and there can be a path backwards, but not one without the other. We don't strip virtues and goodness into pieces, into atoms, and then filter them through the perspective of power. They have to be kept in alignment. But I hate to say this to the right wing, and there's just it's always the same pattern. It's always the same. The right wing always wants to believe that it has more power than it does. And so when it sees an article with a fake confession, it immediately thinks that people are throwing themselves in the mercy of the court rather than the reality of this being bait. And unfortunately, I think the right took the bait on the right wing took the bait on this. I guess maybe I'm just asking for a level of subtlety and discourse that's impossible for the era of microblogging, for the era of Telegram and Rumble and Twitter and YouTube. But the message has to be truth and justice and then reconciliation. Truth, justice, then reconciliation. We are responsible. We believe in second chances. We believe, if we are Christian, in redemption as a sacred duty. But it actually has to be a redemption, not a continuation of the lie under the banner of redemption, not a subversion of justice under the banner of Christian charity. That to me is absolute sacrilege. And again, I don't know. I guess we're going to have to learn these things, as I always say. We're going to have to learn these things the hard way. And I'm not saying that I'm some kind of master of this. Like, I want these people to face justice. I'm furious at these people for destroying the old world and for putting us in this position for years on end, and for hiding the truth away from us, and meanwhile calling everyone who asks questions the worst possible name and humiliating them in front of their friends and family. I'm furious at it. I'm furious at these people. But I don't get to let my wrath and my vengeance rule. That's not my role. My role is to be prudent, and I can't ask for vengeance or wrath. That belongs only to God. The only thing I can ask for is the virtue of truth and justice. And I'm commanded first by prudence and then by Christ to provide forgiveness in all cases that it's possible to give forgiveness within the bounds of justice. But once we try to strip these things down to the raw emotional form, where we can participate in these things as memes, rocketed out into the ether at 288 characters at a time, I think we've really lost the plot. And with that, I'm going to end my little monologue. This is naturally a short one. I didn't really have anything prepared, but I kind of winged it for long enough. And I will go on to answering super chats. So guys, I usually answer super chats in long form, but I'm going to go for, well, I usually target 2.5 hours. We are at the 45-minute mark right now, so I'll probably go for another hour and change, an hour and a half, I guess. Sounds about right. But if you're in the chat and you want to reply me, I might see it and I might be able to answer it. In the meantime, I will pull up these super chats, and I don't know what they're called on Entropy. You can find the Entropy link pinned in the YouTube description at the top. And I use Entropy because none of the money goes to Google, and a lot less of the money is actually kept. So my family can have a little bit more of it in these sort of tight times. But I appreciate you guys' contribution, and I will go forward. Oh yeah, by the way, I didn't want to mention that I think people are planning for the second Sildings event this winter, and I do intend to publish my talk from last year. I've had, as you can tell from the beard, I've been really, really busy this last week, and I am going to be busy for the next 2 weeks. So the content generation outside of this podcast is going to be really, really curtailed. But I do hope to get some more content out after the next 2 weeks. And one piece of content that I do intend to publish is my talk from the Sildings event back in February of 2021. Which I think was a pretty good talk, if I do say so myself. All right, on to super chats, as it is. Tuesday, FA Tuesday for $10. Hey Dave, I've got a big problem. The woman who wants to marry me doesn't want to raise our future children Catholic. This is a relationship-threatening problem. I have had mental health challenges, and I'm afraid of losing my only positive vision for the future. I'm afraid of that losing my only positive vision for the future will put me in the morgue. Okay, well, I mean, this is a very thorny issue, and I'll walk you through the compromises I think you can make. First of all, I do agree with you that this is a very big problem. I mean, obviously I'm Catholic and I want you to raise your children as Catholic. But the more substantial problem is it seems that your wife is not respecting your spiritual leadership, which I'm not saying the relationship can't work, and you should try to make it work, absolutely. But the broader problem that's generating this issue with baptizing your children in your religion, this is going to have a lot of knock-on effects in the relationship down the line. And you need to come up with some standard way of dealing with this. I've seen mixed faith marriages work in the past, but they have to have very, very firm ground rules, because this is what C.S. Lewis said about marriage, is that marriages work in the mode of monarchy because there always has to be a sovereign, a person who decides the exception. And you can let your wife, as I like to do, make 99% of the decisions, but you are the sovereign. You decide that 1% of the time when there needs to be an exceptional decision. And one of those exceptional decisions have to do with questions of faith and ultimate value. So if you're going to make this work in a mixed faith relationship, you need to establish out front what the rules are. And it doesn't sound like, from what you're telling me here, it doesn't sound like you have had that conversation with her yet. I would make sure before you go into any relationship, and it sounds like you're attached to this woman, and I'd always endeavor people to try to make their relationships work. If it, I don't want to psych you out trying to read into the subtleties of the language or whatever here, but I'm going to assume that you're very attached to this woman. Seek spiritual counseling. Go to your priest with this woman and have her talk about her reservations about this when she's in an environment where all the peers agree with you. And if she's adamant about something, some opposition to having her children raised this way or accepting Catholicism herself, develop ahead of time where her objections are and what she can reasonably ask for you and from you as a man, and make it absolutely explicit. Under no condition give her veto power or sovereignty over your religious faith, such that, I can veto his raising his children Catholic today, and maybe I can veto him going from church tomorrow, and maybe I can veto his belief in God on Thursday. No. Right? If you are in the mode of compromise, and even then, I would highly caution you of taking this position, because most women seek to be in a subordinate position spiritually and on questions of supreme value. I would set up firm boundaries so that this can never go any further than what her absolute boundaries are. Talk to her with your priest to get what her absolute objections are, and then make a fence around those objections. Say, like, here are your objections to my Catholic faith, and they'll never go beyond this point. And here are my absolute requirements, and where I need them. Ultimatums are always relationship threatening, and you should be very, very careful with them. But right now, you're in a situation where an immovable object meets an unstoppable force. And this is just a very, very dangerous conversation you're going to have at some point. And it's better to have this conversation sooner than later. And it's better to have this conversation with your priest as your therapist than it is with a bunch of her friends sitting around. Make sure that you're absolutely crystal clear, and then make your decision on what you're willing to compromise for. And I know you very much value this relationship, as you said. I can't imagine you can't make this work, and I can't imagine she won't relent on a core question of how you raise your children, unless she is very, very anti-Catholic, in which case there are deeper issues that need to be talked about with your priest. But that's my answer to this question. So thank you very much. Let's check on the live stream health. Okay, cool. Someone says, Dave, dump her. I can't give direct advice like that. I don't know the situation. But I do think you cannot give up your spiritual leadership of a family, even if you are going to agree to be in a multi-faith family. You are the spiritual leader of the family. And I think it's a very, very bad idea as a man, to have your children raised in a religion that's not your own, I think that's going to cause all sorts of problems down the line. And so some kind of, I think a foot needs to be put down somewhere. And I think that if this relationship is strong and true, she'll be all right with that. Dave, I'm old. Just dump her. Okay, I'm trying to be circumspect and prudential here, guys. You're not helping. Dave, Carl DeVicki for $10. Hi, Dave. I want to start producing content, probably a blog. I have watched your content creator videos. Do you have any advice on what I can do so people may actually read it? Also, like yourself, I'm a full-time young professional with family obligations. How do you make time? Well, for the most part, I don't. And anyone who sent me an email recently has noticed that I haven't gotten back to them in the last week because I've been so busy with everything else. My apologies. It's not personal, I assure you. How I have time is I have a calendar. The reason why this podcast never misses a beat is because I block it off, and my wife has agreed to give me this time to podcast. It's also the reason why my Substack articles never get finished, is because I can't reliably get time on the weekends to finish them. And it's a tragedy. You just have to make time for it when you can. But one thing I've discovered as a married person and a person with family obligations is that the calendar is your friend. An hour or 2 hours of time, or even 3 hours of time, in the case of this podcast, that you have earmarked out and demarcated, and that's part of the flow of your week-to-week schedule, is infinitely easier to conceptualize than 3 hours that you just take for yourself unannounced. Explaining to your wife that you need some me time to go off and do your own thing is hard. Saying, oh, hey, it's Tuesday, it's podcast night, that's just cost of doing business. Now, I give my wife time when she needs to go out and do her extra work activities, and she gives me this time. And this is just part of how the ordinary functioning of a relationship and family life works. And as you get older, routine and scheduling need to play a larger part. And when you're young and you're in your 20s, everything is just on the fly. Everything is just bootstrapping. You wake up and you just do what you can because you have so much energy and you can just overpower anything. And you don't need, okay, fine, you don't exercise or stretch, but then on Thursday you run 5K spontaneously and in shoes that don't even fit you very well. And that's just what you do when you're in your 20s. But when you get to your 30s and your 40s on the horizon, everything has to be part of a weekly and a daily routine. And when you do that, you're going to have more time. It starts appearing. Just as when you start budgeting explicitly, you have more money. One good thing about this inflation is that it really forced us to budget our groceries. And we were surprised at how much money we just blew on groceries we didn't need. It's amazing. It just be very conscientious of how you spend your time. As for how you get seen, okay, here's how you get seen. First thing is Substack is just the blogging platform of choice these days. It used to be that there was a question of whether it was WordPress or whatnot. These days, there's really only one place for writing, and that's Substack. And furthermore, it's a very hard place to get censored from, and it's a very easy place to move out of because of the fact that you have everyone's email addresses. It's also very easy to share Substack and so on and so forth, and it's very easy to make money off of it as well. So it's become the one-stop shop for blogging, and it's not surprising why. It's just definitively better than all the competitors for a variety of reasons. The more pertinent, and I think the more essential thing is two things. If you're writing on current events like I do, you always kind of want to be involved in conversations on the current topics, there was this oh god, it's this person who this old MRA guy. I think it was called Medicor Media or whatever. Not Mr. Medicor, but this other guy, an old MRA era anti-SJW YouTuber. He took a 2-year hiatus, and then he came back recently this month, and he started making like 2015 style content anymore. And suddenly his content, which had gotten thousands of views before, just got almost none. And, he's still doing collaborations with Dr. Random McCam and the other MRI people. And it's getting no traction because the conversation isn't there anymore. I'm not saying that you can't have his opinions or you can't have MRA opinions, but no one's talking about that. And in order to have a relevant political blog, you don't need to have the opinions that are popular. In fact, you shouldn't. You should always be sincere about your opinions. But you need to be in engagement with the opinions that are popular. You need to be in dialectic with what other interesting people are talking about, or with what other oppositional voices are talking about. And so always, as I say, always walk towards the fire, always face the conflict, never turn your back towards the ocean, and try to avoid retreating into ghettos where it's only some very small subset of people. Because as a blogger, the best kind of reader that you can possibly find is the reader who doesn't know they like you yet. And because when they discover you, not only are you getting a new subscriber from a community that you're unaware of, you're also actually changing minds and expanding minds and actually participating in the growth of ideas and the development of ideas, which is presumably the reason why you're doing this to begin with. So that's my advice. The other thing, and this is more technical, is that I highly recommend new written bloggers to have like a SoundCloud account or just use the native Substack the native Substack app to record voice, or to get a YouTube channel, and periodically take your favorite article and either read it in your own voice or have a computer read it and post the audio to YouTube or some other platform, maybe even Substack's podcasting API. And because so many people, basically I would say about 60% of the audience, in fact, they don't read, they just listen. And so you don't know, sometimes your ideas will appeal more to the people who like listening than the people who like reading. And so I'm not saying you have to become a podcaster or a video essayist or whatnot, or record every one of your articles, but you want to have a few instances where you're exposed to that world, so that you're not completely cut off from it. So anyway, Carl, I hope that helps. On to Mim the Dwarf again for $10 USA. Last week's stream was sobering. In our world, Sauron won. The forests were torn up for factories, and the Shire scourged. Are stories where good prevails of any use to us now? Instead, I want stories where the hero knows his line is doomed, that spring will not come in his lifetime, yet he fights on. Yeah, I think that there are stories like that. I think Beowulf, for instance, is one of those stories. That was Tolkien's great thesis in his interpretation of Beowulf and these other pagan epics. These were obviously pagan stories. I hate the word pagan. They were obviously stories that were popular among the Anglo-Saxon pre-Christian religions that were then translated by Christian authors and were given philosophical context by pre-Christian authors. And the context for Beowulf was that he is the last line of the pagan order, and that his death is the sending off of the old world and the beginning of the new one. I'll also think to Moses, who was never allowed to enter the promised land, but is only allowed to see it from on top of a hill before the new generation goes forward. I think that you will have no hard time finding stories of tragedy in the dwarf. There ever were in Western literature. I I mean, that's most of the Greek tragedies have this dimension to them. I always thought that the Odyssey itself was sort of a tragedy of sorts. He does get home and he does reclaim his kingdom, but really only in a nominal sense, because the life he had as king of Ithaca has in some sense passed him by. And not only does he get home so late that his baby son is grown to be a man, he has to do penance to the gods and spend time in exile again before he can finally return. I think we'll have no hard time finding this. And I think that optimism is sort of needed. I guess I do feel a little bit pessimistic. I feel that we're living in very, very dark times. But at the same sense, we're living in very disillusioned times. We're living in times where this order is just going to kind of start falling away, I think. I think that no one can really believe this anymore in the same way that it existed previously. And I can't wait to find out what comes next, because in some sense, it almost can't be more fake than what we're experiencing right now. Although I probably shouldn't say that. I don't know. I don't think that tragedy is ever so bleak as we might imagine it. There are truly bleak stories. But I think that most people who understand tragedy and who look into the mortality of the mortal existence truly understand that tragedy is always the backdrop of a larger story about life, a larger story about renewal. I think about one of the great authors of the contemporary world, Cormac McCarthy. And I think he just publish a book like this week? I believe I heard about that. And if he did, I'm going to be all over it. But I think about his books like Blood Meridian and The Road and No Country for Old Men, very famously. And I think to myself, he is one of the few authors that really understands tragedy very well. Flannery O'Connor would be another better example. And another author, I've read much more of Flannery O'Connor than I've read of Cormac McCarthy. So I feel better. I feel more at home praising her. But I mean, The Road is one of the bleakest novels ever written. But in the way that Cormac McCarthy has, it does have the backdrop of a continued human existence that you can see kind of promised in the background of this completely bleak existence. And we're certainly nowhere near where the world that The Road depicts. Cormac McCarthy's The Road. So I would counsel some amount of optimism, but I hope it helps. Man, I look particularly scruffy today. Not giving a very good example for the people who advocate for temperate grooming habits. At least in the realm of the beard growth. My wife has decided that after telling me across 3 years of marriage that she absolutely detests men who wear mustaches, that maybe she thinks mustaches might be good looking after all. So I decided maybe to experiment growing out a beard and then subsequently getting a mustache. Although I think I'd look really, really creepy wearing one. It might be good to experiment with that for a while. I mean, speaking of kind of things that my wife has introduced me to, she does most of our shopping. And have you guys seen this? This is one of the most deplorable things that I've discovered, is that increasingly electronics come back with spyware on. I'm not like typical 1990s spyware, where it might it sends back a form with their product information back to headquarters. I'm talking about actually we drain your bank accounts with a subscription service. So she bought a bunch of Bluetooth headphones, and these Bluetooth headphones were pretty nice, but they came with a subscription plan because the Bluetooth headphones said, well, this piece of technology that we built it's only operating at half capacity. In order to have the full experience, you need to pay us a few dollars every month, and we'll turn on the features of the electronic system that you bought from us so you can get the full experience as long as you subscribe to our plan. Oh my, this is, it's absolutely insane. So now these pieces of electronics exist as vampires to drain us of resources after we already put money into them to afford their ridiculously overpriced sticker cost. This is absolutely insane. Where is the open source community? In the 90s, in the late, or well, this is more the early 2000s, TiVo had just come out, and everyone in the open source community who was all into Linux back in the day was just falling over themselves to be able to hack TiVo, to jailbreak TiVo, and have a version of TiVo that operated with absolutely zero spyware and that operated with zero ability, that could do things that they didn't want you to do and record copyrighted material and to get around IP controls and all this stuff. And there was sort of this sort of hacking community that went well on throughout the era of the iPhone and the iPad. I think really the App Store killed it, because I remember in the early years of iPhones, everyone was into jailbreaking their iPhone. But then, because of the App Store, iPhones that were jailbroken just stopped working with an enormous amount of the essential software. And then when companies started using iPhones as security services, it became instantly impossible, because the idea, if you broke your Apple's security system, then that could not in turn be used to support the company's security system, since the company's security system piggybacked off of Apple's. And so slowly the electronics we thought we owned became our very own digital collars. This has to be something that the distant community takes seriously. And I don't know. I think there's no future for us unless we can be as serious about jailbreaking all electronics in our households, as serious about that as we are about things like cryptocurrency and financial independence. This was a thing in the 90s. It's got to be a thing again in the 2020s. Otherwise, we've taken a big step back. All right. Ghost of Gen Z. For $4. Hey, Dave, I recently listened to Richard Hanania's latest podcast episode with Eric Kaufman. It was all right. What are your general thoughts on Hanania? Have a great rest of your week. Well, I mean, Hanania is... God, I have almost too much to say about this, don't I? I was about to write a whole spiel about this, and that it's I'm kind of drawing a blank on this, but Hanania's insights explicitly, when he researches something and he actually digs into the data and looks at the graphs and posts things about graphs, he is amazing, and he realizes the problems involved. However, his instincts are absolutely stupid. They're just nuts. They're not nuts, but they're not nuts, because he is a very circumspect individual, but he's also a complete product of modernity, which means that all of his proclivities are pointing in the wrong direction. So he can have a pro-immigration advocate on his podcast, and he can have the pro-immigration advocate spin all of these ridiculous stories about how immigration is going to increase GDP. And the set of questions he asks are all about statistical adjustments, this caveat, that caveat. What about this, this piece of evidence you might have not taken into consideration of your calculations? That's not the problem you need to ask about the pro-immigration libertarians. The questions you need to ask the pro-immigration libertarians are, what is the purpose of a modern state? It's not to make the magic GDP line go up. It's not to be able to get citizens to buy a larger and larger quantity of plastic shit from China. It's for the spiritual and physical health of the citizens. And he had an entire conversation about immigration that never once touched upon the broader responsibility societies have to facilitate the long-term collective, individual, and spiritual health of the peoples who actually live there. And so in many ways, Richard Hanania is brilliant, but he's penny smart and pound foolish. And I know I'm mixing my monetary metaphors there, but I don't care. Pence wise and pound foolish doesn't sound quite right. So anyway, that's my take on Richard Hanania in a nutshell. I probably would have more to say, but it is what it is. Ben White for $3 USA says, Happy All Saints Day. Mass tonight was good. My priest gave a really good homily. It's always good to be reminded of things that transcend this world. I wish you and your family a happy holy day. Yes, well, thank you very much, Ben White. I think I'm not going to discuss my failure or success at fulfilling this obligation today. I may have lapsed. I may be due for a bit of truth and reconciliation myself. But thank you very much for the super chat. Not that I would have exactly known where to fit the obligation in tonight, other than canceling this podcast. Oh, I would have missed it anyway. There wouldn't have been anything open. But anyway, thank you very much, Ben White. Happy All Saints Day. It is a holy day of obligation, I believe. So all you Catholics listening to me in a times and appropriate place, get ye to a mass. To be quite honest, I thought it was tomorrow until just before this podcast started. But that's just me being forgetful in my tiredness. We're at this really weird state. And I hope this phase ends where my son just can't sleep through the night. He's constantly waking us up at ungodly hours because he has nightmares. I've been told that this can last for years. And I mean, I don't know what to say. I guess we'll just be sleepy for years on end. But I know you miss things every now here and there. Toby for $25 USA. Please provide a thoughtful dissertation explaining why AI can never produce art. Well, for 25. Well, I mean, it depends on your definition of art. I can't guarantee you, Toby, that AI can never produce something. I mean, I'll guess. Here's the thing: can AI ever exist? Is the question. Can AI ever be intelligence in the way that we understand it? To me, this seems very, very doubtful. We don't understand general intelligence very well at all, and therefore, it's very, very hard to see how we can mimic it. We're approaching a number of computational barriers. Moore's law, it turns out, is not indefinite. And I think that in semiconductor manufacturing and in raw energy of computation, we might be reaching a limit in the very near future. We might be reaching peak CPU. We might be reaching peak gigaflop, so to speak, in the next few decades. So we can't rule that out. And on the software side, we have a very poor understanding of what general intelligence would actually mean. And so it's very, very hard to ever think of a time where we would create a program where we could say definitively, this is general artificial intelligence. That being said, what we are approaching, however, what we are staring down in short order, and if it hasn't happened yet, even if we hit a disaster, this will certainly be possible, is sort of the Turing limit of AI, where there are very, very few human activities that AI can't produce a copy that would fool people, at least on first glance. So I'm talking about chatbots that will get you to think that they're human for, a full 15 minutes, or art that appears like it was created by an artist and might even win art competitions for people who aren't trying to suss out AI-generated art. this is not what art is. I mean, to me, and this is highly subjective, art is a linguist. I think art, like mathematics, is a linguistic endeavor. Unlike science, which is definitively not linguistic, science is statistical and data-based in observation and experiential in nature. Both mathematics and art are linguistic. And whereas mathematics, in my opinion, is the set and explorations of formal languages, art, and I mean art in the broadest possible sense, is the exploration of informal languages. Languages that seem to contain some amount of truth, beauty, and possibly goodness, that stand in some sense outside, or not completely overlapping with religious impulse, but need to be explored anyway. So when I engage with a piece of art, and when I take it in, and when I discuss it with people, and when I try to really confront it, I'm trying to be open to the artist and to the text itself, creating in me, pointing to some kind of truth it's experiencing that I'm not aware of. It pointing to some facet of reality or the human condition that I'm not aware of. Turing machine artificial intelligence, I don't believe, can do this, for the simple fact that, I mean, so it can't directly do this, because in the event of actually experiencing art, I'm trying to figure out what the artist was trying to communicate with me across the sea of time in most cases. And obviously the AI that generated this art, not being a human itself, there's no inner experience that generated this, and therefore there can be no honest linguistic communication. There can be just the simulacrum of one. And so in a direct sense, that can't occur. In a more indirect sense, I would argue also that the artificial, I mean, me knowing that it's artificial intelligence that generated it, I can't therefore look for some kind of commonality of experience with it. If I were to say, okay, this is generated by artificial intelligence, what does this tell me about my own experience? Nothing, because a Turing machine generated it. I could ask what this tells me about the artificial intelligence that generated it, but a quicker way to do that would just be to do a code review of the actual artificial intelligence. And because this is a deterministic program, I really don't need to take things any further. The only way that this could sort of be artistic in analogy is as if you treated AI-generated art as if it was a Rorschach test, as if these were ink blots that were not generated in any particular order, as if you were looking at clouds and trying to figure out what this cloud looked like or what generated it. I could see some productive artistic experiences coming from that exploration. But in that case, you're really, like I said, you're really more experiencing like a Rorschach test or a cloud than you are an actual piece of art. And you've got the added layer of complexity in the sense that you know that the thing generating this is not a natural process of like water vapor or crystallization, and you know that this is a actual genetic piece of code that is in some sense being trained to deceive you. So I don't know. It feels a little bit too contrived to be sort of an organic experience, and too departed from any kind of humanity to be artistic experience in sort of the linguistic sense, in the sense that art's supposed to communicate something to us. I hope that helps. I hope that's a sufficient dissertation for your needs. I hope that was worth the super chat, because that's all I have to say about it. Maximus Magyar. Well, welcome. I'm surprised you're not donating in Hungarian, Mr. Magyar. But truer people A truer non-Indo-European European people never graced the continent than the noble Hungarians. But Magyar asks, is Anglo-Ortho worth talking to at this point? It seems like he should know better. It's almost to the point that it feels like he's not speaking in good faith. I have no idea what you're talking about, Maximus Magyar. I saw Anglo-Ortho produced a video yesterday. I haven't watched all of it. We had an excellent conversation on my channel, and he gave an excellent talk at the Sildings event. I wouldn't be surprised if he was not attempting to take a step back from politics, but not having seen his latest video, I can't really comment on it. I wouldn't be surprised if the point of that video is we all need to take a step back from politics and focus on ourselves. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the message of it. And I think a lot of people do need to internalize that message. Maybe I need to internalize that message. But I've always been of the opinion that we need to remind ourselves of the situation we're in, as grim as that is. I am a political pacifist. I am an anti-populist. I do not believe in democratic politics. I do believe in parallelism. But I do believe also, and that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast, that I have to express this position as an actual political act and as an actual political position so that I can remind myself and you guys out there not to get swept along with the spirit of the age and not to kind of... I think it's very comfortable to be apolitical in this age as a Christian and to kind of retreat into your interior castle. And I think that might be the majority of our quest, our task at hand. But that's, to me, it's insufficient. To me, it's very important that I stand with the thought criminals, if only symbolically. Because I'm tired of I mean, I live my entire life listening to progressive nonsense and waving it through and nodding my head and pretending like I agreed with it and pretending like I couldn't see its manifest flaws and hoping that it would self-correct itself. And it never did. And I don't think that dissidents qua distance, when they talk amongst themselves, them flexing is another thing entirely. But I don't think just talking about dissident ideas and speaking truth to power is a negative force in this world. And so if he's taking a step back from politics, I sincerely respect that. But it's something that I also respectfully disagree. I think that we do need to have a voice that distinctly reads as political, even as we pursue our own lives individually, and even as we try to reach for the greater truth. Maybe, Magyar, you could clarify. I'll see if you have any follow-up in the Spurg chat, as the Franklin puts it. Yeah, you guys, you got to reply me or I can't see it. If there's a clarification from Magyar at this stage, I can't see it. Yeah, okay, perfect. No. All right, well, maybe Magyar can clarify exactly what his issue with Anglo-Ortho is. In my experience, Anglo-Ortho is a great guy. So I'll just say that. Morgan Allen for $10 USA. I recall Aaron McIntyre commented recently that Moldbug's minimum viable religion would be too easy to hack by virtue of being general. Aaron referred to the abolition of man, so he must be aware of Lewis's concept of the Tao, of traditional morality, transcending culture. Can this not work? Yeah, it can't work. The Tao is an abstraction. I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but there's plenty of abstractions that exist in theory but don't exist in reality. Like, for instance, we can talk about the average person, right? The average person is important to understand. The average American, I don't know, is 5'10". I'm guessing an average American man is 5'10", IQ of 99.5 or 100. Whatever. We could come up with all sorts of qualities that the average person has, that the average American male has. And we can talk about the average person. But the average person is not an actual person walking around in this world. And the same thing is true for things like the natural numbers or the integers or perfect triangles or these things or imaginary numbers if you want to get slightly more abstract. These things are incredibly important and useful when talking about generalities, but they don't actually exist. When C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man talks about the Tao, he's talking about the common sense of natural religion that pervades all healthy human religions, and which we could derive a lot of common moral propositions. But the Tao can't exist in the real world any more than the average person can exist in the real world. There is no average man who has a 5'11", 5'11.33629 height and has 1.2 kids. These are abstractions. They don't actually exist in the real world. And a generalized religion like the Tao is an important concept to understand, that all religions have this commonality, but any religion that actually exists has to be more particular, otherwise it would collapse in on itself. Just like all triangles are imperfect, and there are no such things as real integers in the real world, existing in the abstract Platonic form. These are abstractions. More frustratingly about Moldbug, though, and he wrote an article that was kind of good just a few days ago, is he keeps on making the same stupid mistake with the assertion that we can make value-neutral truth engines. I can't tell you how much I disagree with this. You cannot use prediction markets to create value-neutral truth engines. All truth engines will have to be created inside an institution that has values and that is hermetically closed to outside values. This concept of value-free truth is a complete product of post-Enlightenment Western humanity, which believed for a fleeting moment on this planet that Western Christian secularized morality was the definitive morality. Okay, should we just... Morgan Allen, I hope that clarifies about Moldbug and the Tao not being real things, but just abstractions for purposes of clarification. Maximus Magyar apparently here has a follow-up. Magyar says, he said our political system has no problems. He blamed young men for the state of masculinity and said not doing so would be to deny free will. I'm not kidding. I mean, I feel like I've heard Academic Agent say similar things. So, I mean, I don't know what to say. The problem with blog posts and why I don't react to them is that I'm fairly sure that Anglo-Ortho understands the role of systems and incentives and perverse incentives. But there's also a need for tough talk, right? I'm kind of frustrated with this myself, right? I think a lot, I hate to say it, like this last year, a lot of people dropped the ball when it came to sort of stepping things up. And I did too. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I just didn't have the time I thought I did. I didn't have the time in 2022 that I had in 2021. And certainly not the time I had in 2020. And nowhere near the amount of time I had in 2018 to 2019. And a lot of things went by the wayside in my own life. And sometimes you need people to talk tough to you about this. People do need to put a foot up the butt of young people to get off their asses and actually do things. I think that it absolutely, I don't believe that it's the fault of young men that our society is in the state that it's in. But I can tell you definitively that the only people who are going to fix it is young men deciding that it's their responsibility to make a definitive change in their own life. And I'm including myself inside of that. Maximus Magyar, I think we've mistaken tough talk for political naivety, at least the way you're describing it to me. And I wouldn't make anything of it. Is there an actual debate about the existence of perverse incentives and about the bankruptcy morally of our own government, I don't think there is. I think what Angela Ortho is probably worried about is that the constant outrage porn and counter signaling and endless debates on microblogging platforms is creating controversy on is taking people away from the larger mission of self-improvement and actually making a change in their own lives. But I'm going to move on. American Covidiot for $10. Hi, Dave. I'm a lost time listener. I think that means a long time listener. But first time super chatter. What is your go-to argument with normicons who don't think the liberal project of the last 400 years is the problem? Well, I mean, I don't really have a go-to argument. I kind of tend to see if the best way you can talk to people, and this is true for fiction writing and in expository writing, as well as for argumentation. What you want to do is you want to start with the particular, and then you want to move to the general. Amateurs start with a general and go to the particular because of how we're taught to write essays in high school with your thesis statement up front and then the supporting arguments. And and indeed that's how you're supposed to sort of structure things implicitly behind the scenes. But there's but when it comes to compelling writing, there's a layer over that where you're trying to kind of, there's a hook. There's something that brings your audience into the conversation before you start laying out your argument in this, super mathematically symmetrical way. And so if I'm talking to normicons, I figure out what their objections are. And I just try to pull the threads on those objections. A good example of this, more recently would be affirmative action. Affirmative action has been the reality in this country for years and years and years, for decades and decades and decades. It's probably going to be abolished by the Supreme Court in this next session, but it's not going away. And it's important, and they need to understand that it doesn't go away. They need to look at California and they need to hear the reality. They need to understand the reality that we banned affirmative action in the late 90s. And the obviously racially preferenced policies of the colleges and of the government, they didn't ramp down, they continued to ramp up. You can pull any one of these threads, but it needs to begin with a particular objection and then move to the more general objections. That's the way I'd always structure things that have to do with talking to normicons. I'm trying to think. Affirmative action is good. Race relations is good. The conversation we're having about gender and sex. Explain to me how all institutions have been taken over by an ideology, this gender ideology, and the gender ideology is absolute, as Alex Kasuta put it, is absolute bunk. This probably would work on blue staters more than red staters. But just the sheer insanity of any of the prescriptions that come out of the transgender movement, and the fact that they're endorsed by major medical institutions that are supposed to be our gatekeepers against this nonsense. How is this a product of a liberal political system? And what does it even mean to have a liberal political system if that's the product of it? Numbtooth Bum for $5 USA. Maestro, I struggle with the definition of rights. I grok where you are going with it, but I must protest. My God, the correct Latin-speaking one, made me in his image. What am I promised by him is small, but flay my flesh before I surrender it. Well, does God give you rights? I guess God, I always very much hesitate to say that God makes promises. And I believe that he certainly no divine entity that ever comes to you in prayer will ever make you a promise. And that's one of I believe that to be one of the demarcations between demonic entities and divine entities is that divine entities, divine voice never makes promises specifically. Now you could say that the divine mind does have covenants with humanity, and he does have laws that are eternal, that are everlasting, and there is prophecy that will be fulfilled. But I would never think of that in terms of promises, and I would never think of God's relationship to us in terms of morality and dignity to be something that I would put in the language of rights. To put that in the language of rights would almost be to degrade it in a lot of ways. And that is what it would be to degrade it in a lot of ways. It would be in my mind, because I intimately connect. I mean, the most important thing about modern human rights is that they are literally made to you. What secures your rights is the promise of a sovereign leader, a sovereign interpreter, or a sovereign executive, or what have you. That is the missing piece. Like the normie cons and the David Frenches of the world think that these things, that these human rights are somehow prophecies, covenants with God. They're not. These are promises made to you by highly fallible human organizations. And so I really, really, really want to keep separate the promises that our highly fallible human leaders make to us and the eternal covenants of God. Not least of which because it's very, very important that the former are promises and the former are highly fallible, and the former come from people that have a tendency to try to cheat us, whereas the latter never will. We need to desacralize the concept of government so that we can resacralize the concept of genuine religion. And to me, the meaning of rights and the religious context in which you use it, if I interpret it correctly, is a barrier to accomplishing that psychological transformation in our own minds, if that makes sense to you. So I hope that helps. I'll move on. Another pilgrim for $10 USA. Stephen Wolf caught flack for posts about interracial marriages, calling it as sinful, claiming that people having in-group preference is natural and therefore good. I find this silly, as it places material race above transcendental, God and love. Thoughts. Married to a trad cath Brazilian. I don't know who Stephen Wolf is, but this is a closed theological issue as far as I'm concerned. Absolutely respect your people, be loyal to them, and if you want to marry, if you want to continue on your culture, that's a consideration in the choice of the people who you marry. But once that marital sacrament is invoked, that is sacred and that transcends race. Your promises sacramentally go beyond race, and there are many examples in the Bible of people marrying outside of their race, most notably Moses, who married Sephora, who was Midianite. And I mean, the Midianites, obviously very famously rumored to have fractional sub-Saharan DNA. So, I mean, even in our modern sense, that was very much an interracial relationship, even though I hate the word interracial. I just hate it, especially when it applies to marriages. This is a closed theological question. Marriage cannot be sinful. The covenants that we have between man and women do not have barriers in terms of nation or peoplehood. That does not mean that you as an individual can't make prudential choices of who to marry, and that continuing on your particular culture or your nation can't be a part of your decision in that regard. So to my mind, racial considerations are prudential, not sacramental, and the sacramental force of the covenant always overwhelms considerations of nationhood. The sacraments are more powerful than nation. Blood is thicker than water, but the word of God is thicker than both blood and water. And because of that, it always takes priority. Family always takes priority to race in all circumstances. And when two become one in the covenant of marriage, that is a family relationship. And I know of no Christian who's ever said otherwise. And if they have, I would love to read it. But to me, this is so established, it probably doesn't need a lot more explanation here, right? Maximus Magyar, again, for $50. Whoa, $50 USA. Well, thank you very much. It's very generous. Paul Kingsworth, Buckmaster's Trilogy is excellent. Paul Kingsnorth. I think Paul Kingsnorth was on Alex Kashuda, who is an excellent guest, and I would love to read more. I'll probably get this after the three-body problem. Paul Kingsnorth's Buckmaster's Trilogy is excellent. He's a convert to Orthodoxy. He's quite reactionary in some ways. And he's running St. Basil's School of Writing with Pagot by Alexandria. I don't know what you mean by Alexandria, but that's very, very encouraging. I think Paul Kingsnorth, it's not some critter I'm very familiar with, except for the few things I've read, but I've heard nothing but good things about him. And his interview with Alex Kashuda, I believe it was on Alex Kashuda, was very, very good, if I'm remembering it properly. This week we've had some controversy where Michael Mellis incorrectly misremembered that he interviewed me. To my knowledge, I've never interviewed Michael Mellis. I think he's thinking of somebody else. I think he has me confused with Aaron McIntyre. Not that I'm against it. I think Michael Mellis does great content, although he shows a little bit too much for my tastes as a content creator. But yeah, everyone check out Paul Kingsnorth. I certainly will check out this trilogy. And yeah. Again, I think Magyar, I think everyone has a role to play in this ecosystem of the distant order. Some people will emphasize individual responsibility. Some people will emphasize the perverse incentives and the massive amount of victimization that our society has subjected young people to. And because of this, I think that this is we need to be tolerant of many different people. I have my own lines, but just people, please try to keep an open mind and only reserve ire for people who have really betrayed you in some material way. Just always keep that in mind. Ophelia Multimedia for $10 USA. Just call me Will. Okay, well, all right, Will. Thank you very much. I know my email is a mouthful, so, I'll call you Will in the future if I remember that Ophelia Multimedia is just Will. I've come to believe that the country is splitting into two main cultures, one based on a liberal moral framework, the other one based on a Christian traditional moral framework, where God is highest. I fear the country itself might split along these lines. Well, I think de facto there is a split in moral framework. The problem is political. I think splitting along lines, if we could accomplish a national divorce peacefully, that would be amazing. That would be great. The problem is that how we've set up our political system, it's very, very difficult to split this country along any lines that make sense and that are economically and geographically feasible. And that's where the conflict really comes in. So, Will, I agree with you. The broader question, however, Will, de facto there is a split between people who embrace more traditionalist ethics and those who embrace the liberal progressive orthodoxy. The dynamic that seems to be on the horizon is that what will happen is that the liberal world order, the neoliberal globalist liberal order, its promise of wealth and endless prosperity and endless growth. This is what appears at this stage, speaking in the fall of 2022, this appears to be what's cracking and breaking away and dividing. And the question is, after we begin this descent proper, which I believe will begin in the winter of 2023, when the energy crisis hits Germany properly. Once this breakdown actually occurs in earnest, what will remain of the liberal progressive religion? It will begin itself to crack apart. Some of it will reinvent itself as sort of this absolutely insane kind of fanatical communism. I'm sure it'll be some kind of fanatical gender communism. Another part of it might reconsolidate around a traditionalist framework. But the rest is just going to kind of fall into incoherency, and no one's going to actually know what's going on. So I expect it's really not going to divide into two, ultimately. And this, again, I'm speculating about the future, who knows. I think that what will happen, there will be there'll be a myriad of different religious points of view. And then there'll be one teetering government that tries to hold everything in line as local systems kind of fracture and fray at the boundaries. That's the dynamic I'm expecting. There's sort of two equal and opposite forces pulling in opposite directions. This is a product of parliamentarian and representative democracy, of sort of the dialectic dimension of politics that naturally emerges from mass media and conversations about politics at large scales. That's not actually what's going on. What's actually going on is the disillusionment of the liberal economic system, and subsequently the shattering of the liberal progressive moral vision and promises for the future. And what happens afterwards is going to be much, much harder to see and predict, which is why I think this sort of falling apart in two, I don't think that's going to materialize for a myriad of different reasons. Joshua Ballancourt for $5 USA. Hey Dave, been listening to you since January of 2017 Sargon stream. Thanks for all the great content since then. I remember some casual chats with you on your Clear Discord. Since then I became Catholic, kicked porn, got married, and had a kid. Well, hey, I really do miss those days of the Clear Trads Discord server. I've been thinking there's the dead link still in my YouTube profile. Man, I need to do some digital spring cleaning on my end. But yes, the Clear, I really do miss Clear Trads. I miss being able to talk to people directly and not having to do this super chat thing that's really irritating. I miss being able to make really elaborate, long YouTube videos where I could reliably carve out 3-hour periods to just like write and record them all in one go, so they'd be fresh in my mind and not molder on a notepad for a month before I finally got to them and read them and try to piece them together into a Substack essay. I miss a lot of things about those days, but God be praised that you found yourself back to a religious tradition and getting married. I can't recommend this enough. Seek solidity in these times. You're not getting any younger, guys, and winter is coming. For our friends in Europe, winter is coming sooner rather than later. Find yourselves a family, reconnect with friends, de-atomize. Put down roots, because that which is not rooted is going to get torn out really, really quickly. And so I know you can't just press the get married button, but there's a reason why I didn't say, just break it off for the first super chatter, because I know how valuable these relationships are. You cannot walk away from deep relationships, because the deep relationships you have are what defines you. Anyway, yes. Great. So thank you very much, Joshua, and congratulations on the marriage and kid. I really appreciate the super chat and hope you have a wonderful All Saints Day. Greenlandic Blues for $20. Is that super chatted properly displayed? I wonder why. I don't know why. Okay. This is not displaying properly, but I will read it anyway. I gotta try again, don't I? Oops. Oh dear. Oh dear. Give me a second, guys. I totally misplaced that. Super chat. I have lost it. I apologize, guys. Give me a second here, and I will find this super chat. God, this is irritating. I'll see if I can find it on the Entropy stream afterwards. I need to do this now. I hate having to do technical difficulties. But we will find this come hell or high water, because I hate missing super chats. Here we go. Greenlandic Blues for $5 USA. Love your content. Any chance for a return of long-form videos at any point? I really enjoyed your old videos, Gentle Introduction, Pulp Fiction, etc. Has the Shrek video been scrapped as of now? No, it hasn't been scrapped. I just haven't had time to work on it. I have a few Substack essays that will get turned into videos that I will make as soon as I can carve out a few hours for myself. The Shrek video is... It's just so long. It was... The script was designed for a period where I had more time. I just don't have time the same way I used to. But I've got two Substack essays that I want to finish that will probably get finished in late November. And then other than that, the only thing I can do before November 15th, I'm just going to be doing the podcast because I'm just swamped with work and family. But thank you for the super chat, Greenlandic Blues, and I'll keep on going. Wow, I'm really behind. Sorry about this. Wow. Okay. All right, here we go. Next one. Oh, wow, there are a lot of super chats. Hi, Dave. Thoughts on Hegel's Lord Bondsman dialectic? I don't recall that one. It's been a while since I've read. I don't even know. I've only read Reason in History. Is it from that one? Thoughts on Hegel's Lord Bondsman dialectic. My professor hinted not too subtly that it explains the history of structures of hierarchy, inequality, and oppression, colonialism, patriarchy, etc., and how they will inevitably be overcome. How authentic is this to Hegel's actual thought? Well, I don't know. I mean, you're talking about the actual man Hegel? Look, there's so many. The problem with this question mid-words is I've only read one Hegel. I barely understood it. And even if the Lord Bondsman dialectic does appear in this Hegel, I can't recall it from me reading it 6 years ago. So I'm at a huge disadvantage for this question. I assume that the Lord Bondsman dialectic is the feudal dialectic that Hegel discusses in his treatise on history, in which case this is the classic example that Marx uses. It sounds like your professor is making the classic Marxist mistake where he believes that because Hegel believed that this dialectic was overcome to something more egalitarian, that Hegel believed that the dialectics of history was moving towards a classless society inside a materialist dimension. As far as I can figure out, this is absolute hogwash that was superimposed on Hegel by Marxists. Hegel was not a materialist, he was an idealist. Furthermore, Hegel the man, from what we know of him, believed that history was consolidating along a social organization that looked very much like his home state of early 19th century Prussia, which was a highly hierarchical military state, which was modern in comparison to feudalism, but couldn't be described in the way that you're implying it here. So, I don't know. I am absolutely not a Hegel scholar, so that's the best I can give you, Medwards. Thank you for your contribution. and I'll move on. Tekar for $5 says thought-provoking stream. Thank you. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm halfway through the super chats now. Very good. I think it's 11, so hopefully they're trailing off here. Tildo the Yagan for $10 USA. Hey Dave, I love your work. Thank you for all that you do. I have a question for you. How do you converse with Christians, in scare quotes, who view God as an excuse for their apathy rather than a reason they need to change their behavior, overlook, or how they exist in the world? An excuse to change their behavior, outlook, or how they exist in the world. Thanks. Well, I mean, this is the eternal question. And I hear echoes here of the question put to me previously about Anglo-Ortho and his sort of unpopular opinions about how young men need to take more individual responsibility. A lot of these controversies are manufactured out of context. And I know that the internet robs you of this context, and I'm one to talk. I'm the disembodied head speaking to you out of your computer microphone right now. So I'm really one to talk right now. But this question cannot be answered in the abstract. You learn this very, very quickly, that people who you would have a large ability to influence in a positive way in real life, you can't do that to them online because the constraints you can impose on them are nothing, especially on the internet. Whereas if somebody is your friend, you actually can have an influence on them. You actually can nudge them in the right direction. If my Christian friend is being apathetic and lax on his duties, and I'm one to talk, possibly of being lax on my own religious duties today, you can positively reinforce their responsibility as Christians. If this is a religious leader, if this is David French on Twitter, if this is a person who's not upholding a controversial political position on a microblogging platform, your ability to confront this person in a meaningful way is incredibly limited. My policy when it comes to this is to never start knife fights with other Christians, especially Christian leaders, online. I don't always adhere to this. I get sucked into pushing back on these things in various ways, and it doesn't always work out. But what you want to do is you want to address the issue in the abstract when it comes up online. And when you address it particular in terms of people's behavior, it needs to be sincere, it needs to be direct, it needs to be minimally public, and preferably private. And that's the only way you can really affect change. There needs to be a distinction between, this is something that I think I might be actually stealing this. Well, not stealing this, because this is common wisdom that I believe I've heard from Christians in other contexts. Don't try to convince people of positions in large public conversations. People do not change their positions in that way, and they certainly don't change them on Twitter. Twitter sharpens political divisions. It does not conciliate. It does not synthesize. Those conversations need to go on in private, and they need to be directed in a much more personal way. And if you're Christian or Catholic, you're not looking to create huge political knife fights inside the body of Christ. That's insane, and it completely inverts the nature of the beast as we're dealing with it right now. All right. Let's see. Is there any other way I can answer this question? I mean, I don't know. I mean, and sometimes, like, this is the real irony about this, is that we all kind of cringe at Jordan Peterson about the clean your room bucko stuff. But if you and I'm talking to most of you, I'm talking to myself actually, if we were in a room together, sitting, in a men's group, speaking as Christians to each other, like most of the stuff we'd be telling each other to do would be the same banal Jordan Peterson quotes that we cringe at when they're brought up in a political context. The problem, again, is one of prudence and one of understanding your audience. When you're speaking in a political mode, you do need to stand up for your people. You do need to point out the collective application of poor government and perverse incentives and ways people are being lied to and screwed over. But the most important message you can give individually is going to be one of personal responsibility and taking ownership. And unfortunately, those two things are at cross purposes. And it's very hard prudentially, especially for people like me and Anglo-Ortho who try to speak in a more sincere fashion, it's very hard for us to strike the balance because, again, like the balance between justice and mercy, truth and reconciliation, these are virtues that are in a great deal of tension, especially as internet continue to break down the distinction between what we're communicating politically and what we're communicating personally, which always in classic European civilization was the dividing line for the appropriateness of this type of communication. So I hope that helps, Tildo, the Yagan, great name, but I'm going to go on. Medwards for $3. Also, for that class, I'll be reading post-colonial literature / critical race theory. Oh, so this is the person who is the Hegel. I mean, that almost solidifies this Hegelian mistake as being a Marxist one. Oh my God, is it Stephen Miller who was the big philosopher guy, the objectivist guy? Didn't he do a complete takedown of Marx as a Hegelian interpretation? I'm pretty sure Keith Woods has. And I know me and Keith have our disagreements, our very prominent disagreements on any number of issues. But certainly Keith has read more Hegel than I have and would be a better resource for a Hegelian critique of Marx. That's absolutely a problem. But I'm going to continue on reading this question. Thoughts on Du Bois's double consciousness? Do you know any post-colonial or reactionary literature from a non-Western perspective? Yeah, Yukio Mishima. Yukio Mishima would be a post-colonial author that would be highly reactionary. The problem is that, for a while, the whole post-colonial thing, post-colonialism itself is a product of the State Department and the Cathedral. It's a product of the university system and the State Department and the media going to previously colonized countries and elevating the people they felt reflected their own political ideas back to them. So it's very, very difficult to find people who fit the bill of being sort of properly non-Western, but also properly anti-cathedral. Another example of a post-colonial author, I think that might be properly reactionary, although properly is a bit of a stretch. And I feel hesitant recommending this person because I've read very, very little of them outside of some essays. V.S. Naipaul, he was I think he was a Muslim. He was from the subcontinent, but he was definitely a man of the right and definitely a post-colonial author. You could, if you really had balls, you could propose Alexander Dugin as a post-colonial reactionary author. That might be interesting. What is post-colonial? Is it just not white? Is that the only requirement? I mean, sometimes you can find some pretty based stuff hiding in plain sight in some of this post-colonial literature. Sometimes you really can. A lot of it's, especially if the author is dead and was writing in a time that was, before our own. It's kind of failing me right now, but I'm fairly sure I could find an author who would do that. Ooh, maybe you could pick an Islamic author. What is that? The intellectual the intellectual influence. Is it Ibn Said? The intellectual influence on the Muslim Brotherhood. any of the Islamist authors that come out of the Muslim world would be great examples of reactionary post-colonial literature. You can have all sorts of fun with this because some people are very, very compelling. The only, as far as I know, your teacher will probably interpret all non-white people who write after 1960 as being post-colonial. So you could just have a field day with this, right? I'll probably think of something later, but forgive me for moving on. But I hope when all else fails, Yukio Mishima, right? Because he was somebody who was, I think, inarguably post-colonial, and he also was a total reactionary in the sense that we mean it. I'm pretty sure you could find a Turkish author of a similar vein, but the existence of sort of Ataturkism or Kemalism makes that always a very thorny proposition, because Kemal Ataturk was kind of simultaneously a Caesarist figure and also simultaneously, again, one of these figures that was highly influenced, although much less a puppet, of the State Department. So yeah, if I had balls, I'd do Yukio Mishima because there's a lot of deliciousness there. Nerve AMV Maker for $10 USA. Why do Christian leaders ignore? You could also do Rene Guénon because he did convert to Islam, right? And so he was an Islamic thinker who was a core reactionary thinker. That would be a little bit more of I think a stretch, because your teacher would almost certainly interpret Rene Guénon's conversion to Islam as being part of colonialism and not post-colonial, but you could try that if you wanted to. Why do Christian leaders ignore? So Nerve AMV Maker says, why do Christian leaders ignore their great literary tradition? Milton, Hans Christian Andersen, O'Connor, Gene Wolfe, etc., etc. Christians have a very sophisticated literary tradition that most are totally ignorant of. Ignorance of this tradition makes one feel inferior to the world around them. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like as Catholics, I hear about these authors all the time. Catholics have been much more careful about cultivating their tradition than Protestants have. Right now, I mean, I've just come from this stupid, again, talk about sort of idiotic meme plexes on right-wing Twitter. We have this whole back and forth on the various microblogging platforms, be it Telegram or Twitter or whatever, or Gab, about Reformation Day. And, all sorts of memes about Oliver Cromwell being based or not based. All sorts of back and forth about the Huguenots. And, what did it create? A bunch of meaningless knife bites that went absolutely nowhere. I'd much rather hear about Protestants resurrecting things like the Pilgrim's Progress or Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, not my cup of tea. I always preferred Dante, and I haven't read it since high school, so maybe I'm missing out. Maybe it's way better than I remember it. But just hearing a Protestant's perspective on that would be amazing. And the fact that just so much of old literature from the 19th century is just infused with Protestant sensibilities. There is a supreme Anglican sensibility to everything that, say, for instance, someone like Carlyle or and I know Carlyle was something of a deist, something like Carlyle did, but more pertinently, something like someone like Charles Dickens did, that those two things are really inseparable. And that needs to be more explored. The fact that we don't see Protestant Christianity when we read Dickens is a failure of the Protestant Christian imagination. It's also one of the prospective failures of neo-paganism. I asked this pointed question to neo-pagans, and I never got really a good answer from it. And this is a sincere question, not a confrontational one. How do you as a neo-pagan read something like Charles Dickens or Crime and Punishment or George Eliot's Middlemarch? And how do you incorporate the spirituality that is infused in that work as a pagan? I just don't know how you do it, because it seems that everything you're fighting to subvert and destroy is sort of contained in the most vital portions of the Western culture that you want to have live. I don't know what it means to turn my back on that as a thinker. And but again, this is a good question. I don't have an answer for this for Protestants. I really think that they should resurrect their own literary tradition because it's so strong and it's never properly explored. Just like I don't know, like why isn't the music of J.S. Bach a more prominent part of Lutheranism? That never made sense to me, right? We've had Bach masses in my Catholic church. The music, of course, not the not any Lutheran liturgical innovations. I never understood why that's not more prominent in Protestant Christianity. But I don't know, Nura Van Beemaker. I haven't seen this problem as prominently expressed in Catholic circles. The one problem I do oftentimes see is that there is a preference for older Catholic authors from the early 20th century, people like, again, O'Connor and Tolkien, and a de-emphasis on new and up-and-coming authors who were Orthodox. And I know, call no man Orthodox until he's dead. It's always... Catholics in particular, we're always very hyper aware of celebrity Catholics betraying us or betraying orthodoxy. And so there's sort of a standoffishness when it comes to newer works. But I do think that there are a substantial number of newer Catholic authors out there, that we could explore. Maybe more orthodox ones at this stage, but still very much worth exploring. Okay, I'm going to move on. Asteroidal Assassin for $5 USA. I'm a Muslim who's against immigration. If my family had just stayed in Syria, I could have joined the military and fought ISIS and either become a martyr or a war hero. My question is, how do I cope with the psychological horror of living in the West? Well, I don't know if I can really... if I were somebody who had recently immigrated to the West... Syria is going to stabilize. The Syrian war is over, isn't it? I don't know. If I were in your position, I would get a college degree in engineering and be one of the people who rebuilds your country. Be one of the heroes who builds the new Syrian Sultanate for yourself. Take what you can from this dying carcass of the West and build your own country. I don't know. You can stay in the West if you want to, but I wouldn't count on any promises progressives make you, because I think the progressive order is going to die, and when the progressive order dies, there's going to be probably conflict. And if I wouldn't, as somebody who has very shallow roots in a country, I wouldn't want to take a bite of that if I didn't have to, especially if I might be welcomed back to my own country as a hero who could rebuild it. That would be my perspective. I don't see why Muslims would want to. There's this really funny meme that was published today where, let's see if I can pull it up. I'll read it. Well, I don't have the ability to display it. Well, at any rate, it was this parody of WWF where it's Great Britain Thunderdome, where the advertisement goes, Thunderdome UK, we have every single ethnicity airdropped into the same tiny island, and now they're all gonna fight it out, figure out which one's gonna win the whole thing. Kind of a little racy for Twitter, but where is the lie? I don't know if I would really want to have a part of the sorting out that's going to be occurring right now and the compromises that will need to be made. It's going to be a mess. And if there's a more straightforward path to be someone who builds something, I would always take that. Unless you want to cast your hat into Thunderdome. I don't know, right? But thank you very much, Asteroidal Ben White for $5 USA. Hanging out with people in my suburban Catholic young adult group, I can't help but think the pretty brunette today will become the nagging feminist harpy in their 40s. Without intervention, the Carly to Karen pipeline is 15 years. Oh yeah, you know what stops the Carly to Karen pipeline? What stops the Carly Karen to pipeline is kids. You give her a baby or two, women start thinking more long term. They will. And I don't know. Obviously, peer group matters a lot. If you're in a blue area and these beliefs, these progressive beliefs, look high status, there's temptation there. There's drift, right? But if you properly impress this woman, she's going to move to the right with you. Furthermore, the second she has kids, even without you, she's going to move to the right. And in between those two life events, the idea that she's going to end up being a feminist seems like it's probably a lower... I think, Ben White, this concern, you're really fighting the previous... this was a concern for younger Gen Xers and older millennials. Like, you marry a woman, you move to San Francisco, and then the Me Too movement happens, and she decides that, it's prestigious to be man-hating, right? Or maybe, maybe she actually is a man if you live in San Francisco or something like that. That's because I think that in many ways, the prestigiousness of progressive ideas really reach their apex. I really do think that we're going to see a decline. They're going to maintain their hold over most of the ruling class because they have to, but kind of the freshness of them is going to decline precipitously. And that means that their reach into the suburbs is probably also going to decline. And so, in some sense, I think you're fighting the previous war, the war of the previous generation. If you're a Zoomer, which it sounds like you are now, the second thing that happens is that as soon as this girl becomes a wife and a mother, she's going to be faced with all her friends, and if she lives in a blue area, she's not going to want to become part of a community where single women who in their 40s who are feminists have higher prestige than mothers do. Because she's not going to have time to pull as much of a career as the single feminist counterparts are. And furthermore, those single feminist women who never got married are going to be super, super, super bitter against women who do have kids and who are married. And they're going to invent passive-aggressive ways to hate on them. And in the absence of a hegemonic feminism that rules the universities, and that's super cool, as existed from 1980 to 2020, it's very, very hard to see how this vindictive quality of old unmarried women isn't going to cause married women with children to run screaming from that, if not all the way over to reactionary ideas, to something that is reasonably conservative. So, I think that, I think this fear is founded, but I think that if you choose properly, husband correctly, and are aware of the time it is, I think it's not as much of a concern as you might be making it out to be. It's manageable, we'll say that. Joseph Inons for $15 USA. I accidentally went to a Spanish mass tonight and noticed couples of boyfriend and girlfriend attending together. Not something I've seen in English masses. Well, I don't know what you mean. When my wife and I were dating, we went to mass together. Oh, do you mean like, that they're not chaste dating? Is that what you mean? Like, going to mass with your girlfriend is one of the things that is absolutely allowed last time I checked. So they're as the old fogies used to say, they're living in sin. That's pretty common in immigrant communities because they're assimilating to the American norm, which is doing that. I'm not so sure what the reaction is. Are you a Spanish speaker yourself, Joseph? if you're friends with them, maybe you can talk to them about it. Maybe you can talk to the priest about it. But really, if you're trying to pull an ethnic community away from its gravitational orbit, like collectively away from its gravitational orbit, you're undertaking a Herculean task that you're totally unequipped to as an individual. You might be able to move one person to a more base position in real life, realistically speaking. It reminds me of that Flaming Lips song, "Waiting for a Superman." You know, can you lift a fly with a crane? Can you lift the sun into the sky? And that's what you're undertaking. You can rage against the decrepit state of many modern Catholic communities, but the only realistic option you have is to separate yourself from them with a group of friends that you trust, and rely on that instead. Asteroidal Assassin for $5 USA. Question: how does Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, and so many other conservatives manage to not get suspended from Twitter, but me, the conservative leftist, gets banned from the internet on a regular basis? Am I too based, or just an impulsive idiot? Oh, pardon the yawn, Asteroidal Assassin. I couldn't reach for the mute button in time to avoid that one. Well, I mean, they're blue check marks. They can get away with murder, can't they? We've known this forever, that the Ben Shapiro crowd, the establishment knows that they can't cancel them. Otherwise, they're going to cancel all conservatives. And they really, really, really don't want people moving straight from Ben Shapiro onto the myriad of people to his right, which is a huge fear of modern progressives. So, I don't know. Ben Shapiro could literally have the bodies of children in his refrigerator, and he wouldn't lose his blue check mark. But don't think that you can pull a Kanye West on Twitter because you're just repeating in quotations what Ben Shapiro himself said. So look, I don't make the rules. We all know there's a double standard, and my hypocrisy has a definite shelf life. But thank you for the super chat. Dreadnought for USA, $5. The Amnesty article, in my honest opinion, isn't bad. It's humiliation. It's a humiliation ritual as well. It's the we did these things, and it doesn't matter if we were right or wrong because we will never be held accountable, and we can force you to accept that. Yeah, that's another thing. It's I do think it was bait, but it is also a brag. It's like, oh hey, look we're gonna give ourselves amnesty, but I don't know. It's like all of these things that are written by sort of these center leftists. They are trying to sort of absolve themselves of a certain amount of guilt they have as well. So I wouldn't say it's a complete flex, but I mean, I think a lot of people on the right misinterpreted it. This article was not written from a position of weakness. It was written from a position of strength, and part of that was a humiliation ritual. Part of that was a baiting exercise. But what it certainly was not was a prefiguration of capitulation that was meant to trigger an extended discussion of how we're going to punish the worst offenders of the regime's mendacity. That's what it most certainly was not. So thank you for the clarification, Dreadnought, but I disagree with you, so not much to add there, I suppose. Bartholomew the Red for $10 Canadian. Hi, Dave. I'm a maritimer from Atlantic. I'm a maritimer. Sorry, I'm a maritimer from Atlantic Canada. The maritime provinces are Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, where my wife was born, actually. Well known for its folk music. The Cape Breton folk music from up there. Your talks on the importance of folk culture have inspired me to take up the fiddle. Any advice on how to get rid of the scratchy beginning sound? Hope you and your family have a blessed All Saints Day. Okay, so yeah, actually some really good advice. This is so such inside baseball here. Oh dear, is this? My battery is running low. That's not good. Oh, of course. Sorry, I'm unplugged. No wonder. Okay, perfect. If it would be really bad if this live stream ended suddenly. Okay, so for the fiddlers out there, obviously, if you're taking a fiddle or a violin, your instructor will have given you bowing exercises, kind of like, the Mr. Miyagi, like wax the windows sort of things where you do with your wrist and your arm. The next thing is to kind of practice where all the strings are, the string crossings. This is all classical stuff. You've probably already done it. And to sort of see how the bow goes across the string so that it's straight on the string, because the way it looks when you see it pulled straight across the string is not actually how it looks on the actual instrument. So go do it in front of a mirror. Do your string crossings in front of a mirror, your scales in front of a mirror, and that will help you. And also, practice the motions on your arm. But once you have the basics of actually how to bow a violin or a fiddle down, there's a few hacks you can do with fiddling music. The first one, and this is cheating, is you can. One of the worst things in fiddle music is that you can get yourself in a position where you run out of bow, where you need to change bow direction to keep the rhythm, and you run out of it, and so you have to change the bow pattern, and it sounds really disjointed with the rhythm you want to procure. So what a lot of people do, and some experts do fiddle this way, is they hold their bow on the middle so that there's less bow, and so that you're using less of your bow, and it's easy to move up and down the strings. There's not as much leverage there. Now you're losing a lot of the power you have in the fiddle. Not a lot of the power. You're losing some of the power, but you're getting a lot of control by holding your bow. And that's a total faux pas in classical violin, but a lot of folk musics do that. The second thing is that when you're going to the full bow method, if you graduate from holding it halfway down the bow, try to keep your bow use as little of the bow as possible. And keep it as centered as possible, so that you have as much energy to move around as you can. Another fun thing to do. Here's another advice from me, Bartholomew. Try this tuning. Okay, check this out. Tune your lower strings down. Tune them up, so that your violin is tuned A-E, so that the lower two strings are the exact same tunes as the upper two strings. Then play your fiddle tunes that way and just double stop the hell out of everything. Play everything double stopped. Every single bow goes across both strings. It actually sounds really good. You can't mess up that way. So if you tune A-E on the fiddle, and a lot of people like Raina Gellert for bluegrass do this, it sounds amazing, and you can play a lot of folk music double stopped and it sounds really stylish. Hopefully those tips are not too advanced or too pedestrian for you, but I can't really gauge your level, so I can't give you advice. Probably right now I've lost my entire. Oh, hey everyone! Welcome to How to Play Folk Fiddle, the podcast. I'm surprised you didn't tune in for that, but I hope that helps. Yeah, just and also slow down. That too. No one wants to slow down, right? We all want to play at tempo. Oh, also, if you're learning syncopation, just practice the Georgia shuffle while you brush your teeth. Da 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 da. Always, as I hate to say it, as a European, as an indigenous European person, syncopation is kind of hard for us. Learning to emphasize the offbeat, maybe not as natural in your culture as it is in other cultures. And so you need to train yourself to think, emphasis on the offbeat, emphasis on the offbeat. And once you learn that, you can kind of get into a groove as well. So I apologize for the geek out on fiddling, and I'm going to go on to the next super chat. Massa Damnata for $5 Australian. Are the labels right, left wing really that useful? E.g., most right-wingers fully embrace liberalism. Is there a better word that unambiguously conveys opposition to the ideas of securing individual freedom and equal rights as the primary purpose of government, well, I don't really consider right wing and left wing as like positions the way you're using them, Massa. I consider them as sort of dialectic directions towards antinomian or pronomian perspectives, or more independence or more dependence, if you want to put it that way. And the right and left wing are useful in broad historical analysis because it's important to understand that especially in democratic institutions, and especially during periods of abundance, human societies have a natural tendency to drag towards the left, become highly, highly antinomian. And it's also very easy to categorize things as more or less left or right wing. And because of that, as intellectual directions in the abstract, left or right wing are very, very useful. As sort of political positions, they're not very useful, and you pointed to one of the positions right here. Liberalism itself is considered a right-wing position in America, which is absolutely ridiculous. Liberalism is an old left-wing position, and it's only now being sort of replaced or sort of upgraded because the left-wing drift towards dependence has kind of shed it. It's moved past it as, say, a cicada emerging from its first skin has hatched out of its former body, and the left wing, the current right wing, is left with the husks. So I would just encourage you, as I talk about left wing and right wing as directions, not as actual positions people hold in the abstract, and certainly not as a category for any serious political ideas. So I hope that helps. But thank you for the super chat, Massa. Another one from the Magyar, from the Hungarian, for $3 USA. I'm going to a quasi-mission trip in Sierra Leone for 2 years. I won't be able to follow politics. Advice? Well, God bless you. Sierra Leone definitely needs help. I don't know what you're seeking advice for. I mean, enjoy your vacation from politics. I don't know. I've never been on it. I've never been to Africa, certainly. And what I would say is keep an open mind. Don't expect Africans to be Europeans. Make friends across cultures, but respect them, and respect that. This is something that I think, I assume you're Hungarian, but the way you're at this question, since I've never known very many Hungarians to go on mission trips to Africa, and I've known many Americans to do just that, I'm assuming that you might actually be an American Hungarian, in which case I would just, my advice would just be, don't be your typical American who wants to break down boundaries. Respect the natives there as natives and don't try to change them beyond what changes are necessary to bring the light of truth and God to them and to help them be better Christians. But don't try to transform them, and don't expect anyone else to conform to your tendencies as a Westerner. Respect the fact, I had never tried this in my own life, but respect the fact that you're a weirdo for being a Westerner, and I think that they'll respect you more for that. And, give them credit for their own civilization and the ways that their civilization is a lot less paused and degenerate than our own is. I doubt they have a problem with replacement level fertility rates in Sierra Leone. But good luck and God bless, Magyar. I'm going to go on. Novum. Okay, so that's it. Novum for $3 USA. Any advice for late 20s men that feel like they're socially developed? Any advice for 20s men that feel like they socially developed slower? It took me a little longer to realize what thick skin meant. And despite keeping a job and making rent and saving to spare, I still feel behind in my own age bracket. I kind of feel like I have the same advice for men in their 20s Develop a hobby that you really care about and can do competitively, and kind of step into that. Have sort of a third place and a third group of, more specifically, other young men that are your peer groups and that think that you're a good stand-up guy. Know how to throw a party. Know how to organize events. Force yourself to do those. Take responsibility if you think it's a good opportunity. If you're in a church, now there's various different churches. Now I think you should always support your church, but if you're part of a thriving church, start up a book group. A lot of churches really want young people to move into leadership positions. Some other churches want young people to babysit very old boomers and just kind of and I don't know if that's necessarily the most productive. I mean, I always think supporting your church is productive use of your time, but there are trade-offs there, and there's nothing like being a leader in a church that's much more young. I don't know. I always think that growth is found in collectivity and peer groups, and for men in particular, those peer groups have to be directed to something external. And the best place to find those external things is in sports, is in competition, is in music. But hey, failing that, nerdy board games might be okay as well, right? In a pinch, as long as you're meeting people in person. But always make sure that the people that you do these things with, you're building a relationship outside of the events themselves. After you do the thing, you go get drinks. After you do the sport, you go out and have a celebration. And you can invite them over later in the week to have dinner together or something like that, right? Always be building relationships, because I think that's how you grow and discover who you are as a man. I don't know how to do that in spiritual isolation. I know that many men who have been hermits, but it's just not something I have contact with. And so that's my advice, Novum, for men in their 20s. Owen Zaleski for $3. Dave, you mentioned on Substack about posting articles and writing essays. Can you post original art and stuff like webcomics in Substack? Billy the Kid versus Dracula is still in the works. God bless. I think you can. I know Default Friend has a podcast that is that exclusively on Substack? You can definitely have gated audio on Substack, and I can't imagine why you couldn't have gated pictures or gated art. I think Substack is pretty close to a one-stop shop for high-quality periodic content. I don't think it replaces YouTube or Twitter, obviously, because it doesn't go out to a general audience. But if you're trying to sort of keep a very tight group of fans together, Substack just seems to be the silver bullet, and it seems to would be fine for that purpose. I think I don't know how this is, but it used to be about 10 years ago that SoundCloud was the place to do this. But I haven't used SoundCloud in ages, and to me, it just seems like it's just overwhelming. It's overwhelmed with ads and sort of like the whole aspiring rap musician type deal. And for that reason, it seems a lot more of a skeezy place than that I like. Asteroidal Assassin for $3 USA. To answer the previous super chat about AI art, yes, it is art. It's just that there is no value, and it is an insult since AI art is just mass copying other arts and photographs. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what it is. It's basically like that technology they had in the 90s that did the T1000 faces, where you could merge one face into another face. And it's just that really, really, really fast with a broader range of motion. And so it just generates new faces by slightly modifying them and re-merging them into the rest of their faces. What do you have at the end of that? You have a lot of pictures that look like pictures. Some things that could fool humans into thinking that it was created by a human, but ultimately you don't have meaning, you don't have catharsis, and you don't really have a meaningful conversation about the nature of the human condition, and not something that I can imagine we would give any meaning or grounding to. But thank you very much. All right, guys, we're coming up on 12 o'clock, so last super chats now, please, before I end the stream. Fridtjof Roosevelt for $10. My wife and I have location-independent jobs, thus could live anywhere. Where would you live if you could live anywhere? I want to escape urban decay and consider the long term where regions are headed. Well, I mean, if I could live anywhere, but the thing is that, no man is an island. You need to have community. So if you and your wife were having kids or have kids, you want to move to a place that has a pre-existing religious community that can support you, or where you have ready access to family that can help with the children. Me and my wife live kind of apart from family that can help us, and we've really paid for that. There's a reason why I've lost a lot of time in 2022, and a lot of it has to do with a very little support in terms of childcare. And if it was just geography, I might move to a place. I always really like the mountain states, and so I know Utah has a reputation of being Mormon, but based on geography, I would really love Utah or Colorado. And I guess there's a case that Utah might be the best holdout against a paused U.S. government because of the strength of the Mormons as a political counterbalance. I don't know how true that is, but really, practically speaking, you want to pick a community that is strongest for you in terms of the other religious believers that are close by, that are near at hand. And that's the decision. That's how I'd make the decision. And anything other than that, maybe the Plain States would be useful. There were a bunch of sort of intentional crunchy Catholic communities, I believe, in the Plain States, and one in Florida, I believe. Okay, Nicholas Dollinger for $3 USA. He says, I'm getting dinner with Molebug this Friday. What advice would you give for breaking bread with such an evil and scary man without falling under the sway of his dangerous fascist views? Well, don't forget to ask him about his opinion on Hitler Lives, right? Man, I only have one question for Molebug, and that is, he dominates most conversations that he's in, and, God love him. In a way, he's earned it. He was one of the OG people in this sphere, and even if we might have massive disagreements with him now, the contribution he made intellectually to the sphere is just undeniable. And I want to agree with Jay Burden here. We have a really distasteful tendency of throwing under the bus thinkers that are useful to people at earlier stages of the process. But that being said, the big question that I would put to Curtis Yarvin is value-neutral government isn't possible. I just laid it out there, and I don't see any way around it, because his examples historically of truth engines being successfully used have all been inside systems that have had very, very thick values, if only implicitly. And so the idea of his most recent article that you can create a truth engine and not have that truth engine corrupted by politics in a value-neutral system through the magic of prediction markets just seems to me to be absolutely insane. And I want to know, I guess I can't be a fly. I can't be the fly on the wall at your dinner with Molebug. And saying that, I immediately think of my dinner with Andre, but with Mencius Molebug, right? Yeah, you can be the Wallace Shawn guy listening to Molebug go on and on about Hitler Lives. I can't be a fly on the wall and hear how we'd answer this, but I really, really want someone to hold Curtis's feet to the fire over the idea of value-neutral government and its impossibility. And I really do think it's impossible. I really do think it's impossible. Ben White for $3 USA. what are the odds of this election being fortified? A more serious question is, has your opinion changed since you made the Why I Don't Vote video? No, my opinions haven't largely changed. I think that I would vote, right? I would vote in certain elections where the outcome was highly localized or it was very, very close, or there was some symbolic benefit to vote. But I don't think that broadcasting your vote in a symbolic election where your vote does not matter should never be done. It should be very, very rarely done, in my opinion, by people who consider themselves sort of intellectual leaders. Your political opinions, and I know the grand irony of doing this, they should be held very, very tightly. And I think that political blocks are the most powerful when they're a single issue, and when they can come into political systems suddenly. Now, if this election is actually fortified with extreme prejudice, so to speak, none of this matters because they're going to discover a mysterious dark matter of voting block at the 11th hour that will give all of their preferred candidates the boost they need to get past to get past the finish line come Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. And I think they'd be incredibly stupid to do that, because I think that in many ways this election, if it goes the same way as the one 2 years ago, it's going to increasingly degrade their credibility, which any intelligent manager would know is the higher commodity than keeping the Republicans entirely out of Congress. But who ultimately knows, right? It's a toss-up. I would be selective on the elections you vote for. Be comfortable not voting. Be comfortable saying, this election, I have no say in it, and it doesn't mean anything, just letting it go. But I would definitely vote for my school board. I would definitely, try to exert your weight locally in local politics. Pac-Man Respecter for $5 USA. Could you go a bit in depth or point to someone that does about the introduction of Tau into 40K as a progressive bludgeon against the Imperium? I don't know much about the universe, but always enjoy it when you and Stargon speak about it. Well, I do have sort of a quasi video coming up on Warhammer 40K that I promised, and I'll probably get out fairly soon. So I'll mention the Tau in passing then. I don't know. The Tau is the ultimate get out of grimdark realities for the creators of Warhammer 40K. It would be very, very easy to make Tau the good guys and the Imperium the bad guys. I don't think that they ultimately will. I think what Games Workshop is gearing up for is sort of like this Age of Sigmar reimagining of Warhammer 40K, where you have a myriad of good races in alliance against like the myriad of bad guys like the Necrons, the Tyranids, and Chaos. I think that in many ways robs the universe of its flavor. I think that you can't do that and still feel like a grimdark universe if you have aliens and humans working together for the greater good. And the Tau definitely embody the beginning of the end of this. Early iterations of the Tau had them as sort of evil Vulcans. They like sterilized people, and their supposed egalitarianism and multiculturalism were a facade for a racial caste system that was portrayed in early editions of the game as very, very dark and very, very non-preferable for humans. They were very, very unironically going to basically just sterilize the human race and end it once and for all when they find if and the unlikely event that they conquer the galaxy. But just like everything has, the Tau and the lore have been softening and softening, and the rough edges of them have been filed off successively until now. They feel more and more like a Star Trek race. But Pac-Man Respecter, one of the things I actually do intend to finish is a Warhammer 40K themed essay/video. So in celebration of the 40K mark. So I'll work on getting that out when I have a spare moment in the coming weeks. Dreadnought for $10. This is an excuse to give you money, but could you elucidate on what you think the effects of bioshocks, atom, and plasmids being introduced to our modern progressive society would be? Also, God bless you and yours, and may he make us all saints. Well, yes, that's the one prayer we can all say. Dear God, make us all saints as imminently as possible, as flawed as we are. We always tell ourselves sainthood is for later. I don't know. But there's a non-trivial answer to this, Dreadnought. Because this is, I'm going to rehash one of my disagreements with Millennial Woes on transhumanism. The problem with this whole idea of gene editing as eugenics is that it's not going to be eugenics. C.S. Lewis is the only person who really understood how this would eventually work. And apparently we kind of unlearned what he explained in The Abolition of Man. Is that the second you can redefine what is human through genetic editing, you don't get a better human because the standards of what constitutes better and worse are based on humanness. So what you get is simply the whims of the ruling class projected onto your genome. So potentially, in a sort of Dutton-style way, humanity could be getting genetically better over time, evolutionarily, or it could be degenerating. But once we take it upon ourselves to be the designers of the human genome, no human standard can constrain that. So we're not going to be shooting lightning out of our hands. We're going to be melting ourselves down into gendered confusions. We're going to be creating horrible monsters of ourselves through successive gene editing to basically satisfy our ever-changing whims, but in reality to be satisfying our ever-changing whims as directly influenced and controlled by our ruling classes, who want to, forever and ever, keep us dependent on the system, and will forever encourage us on making modifications to our own bodies that are degenerate, and that cause us to be more dependent on the system itself, because in that process lies the consolidation of power into more and more bureaucracy at higher and higher levels of government. And so what the possibility of plasmids or atoms holds for the human race, e.g. instantaneous gene editing, as it's depicted in the game BioShock, is not X-Men powers or sort of Wrath of Khan neo-superhumans. It's the degeneration of the human race into ugly homunculuses that exist only for their own self-gratification. That's the natural consequence. Takar for $3 USA. Shrek, PUA, flexing non-existent powers. Dave, going to distribute punches soon? Yeah, guys, you realize that saying Shrek continuously doesn't instantly give me the amount of time I had back in 2019. You do realize that. But I appreciate the super chat, and thank you very much. Creeper Weirdo for $3 USA. If we tell people that the black pill makes you transition, will black pillers stop being so cringe? Any dose. Also, why does it seem black pillars are so embracing of transhumanism? I don't know what you mean by black pillars. I mean people who are just negative? Don't they see how gross it is? Well, but I don't exactly know who you're talking about when you say black pillars. For instance, I consider Thinking Ape, although he's a friend, to be a black pillar. And I don't remember him embracing transhumanism. Who it sounds like you're referring to is sort of the Nick Land accelerationists. And in this case, it's really obvious. Nick Land and the accelerationists, they believe in transhumanism not because they believe it's going to be good in any sense that we would recognize good, but simply because they believe it's inevitable. And they believe that it happening early will cause ultimately less harm on the human race than it happening later. They want to kind of get over this hump we're on. And so I think that's really the explanation about why people who you might call black pillars tend to be more positive about transhumanism. They see this, it's like nuclear war for Curtis LeMay. They think that we're going to be in a war, a genetic war at some stage, and we might as well do it now when when we have the advantage, when we have the element of surprise. And I'm not going to say that they don't have at least a Machiavellian point. It might be better to have this comeuppance come sooner rather than later. But as Nick Land himself prophesies, it will be horrific. It will not be just Chad humanity springing forth from a test tube. There's no incentive to do that. Okay, thank you very much. Sam153, evening, Dave. Tip for the streaming effort. Well, thank you very much, Sam153, and thank you for helping me get through this. And finally, the last super chat of the night. Good, because I'm just at my time period and about ready to read the psalm. We have Fridjof Roosevelt for $5 USA. Wait, I just read this. He says, my wife and I have location. Did you just send this twice, Fridjof? I think you might have. Yeah, he says, my wife and I have location-independent jobs. Where should we move? I've already answered that, so I will respectfully decline. I would just say, find a place where you think you will have people to support your future family life. Thomas777, again, large disagreements with him politically, but he did have a good point. I think cities might be over. They really are an artifact of a previous time. The only thing that can save cities is green regulations, because at this stage, we can live. A lot of us can live wherever we want to. Our work is dependent on a laptop, and so why wouldn't we? At any rate, guys, I think that's all of the super chats I have for tonight. I'm at my time, so I will read the psalm for tonight, which is Psalm 14. Appropriate, I suppose, because I was counseling wisdom at the beginning of this live stream, and now here we are. Let me just check on the stream health here. Good. Psalm 14. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Their deeds are corrupt and depraved. Not a good man is left. From heaven the Lord looks down on the sons of men to see if any are wise, if any seek God. All have left the righteous path, depraved every one. There is not a good man left, not even a singleton. Will the evildoers not understand? They eat up my people as though they were eating bread. They never pray to the Lord. See how they tremble with fear, without cause for fear, for God is with the just. You may mock the poor man's hope, but his refuge is in the Lord. Oh, that Israel's salvation might come from Zion. When the Lord delivers his people from bondage, then Jacob will be glad and Israel will rejoice. And with that, thank you all for listening in to this broadcast from Fiddler's Green. I wish everyone a very blessed All Saints' Day, and have a wonderful rest of the week. I'll see you next Tuesday. Good night.